Welcome everyone back to From the Ground Up podcast. Thank you guys so much for being here. Guess what? I have these sweet new dad hats in. I actually just ordered one as a sample, but I kind of like how it looks. Tell me what you guys think. Should I print some more of these? But anyway, we have other stuff available at portcitypythons.com, portcitypet.com. We have isopods available, a lot of cool species. I just put up giant oranges, which are really, really cool isopods and super active. All the colors of the powder oranges, but bigger and take care of a little bit more waste. So powder oranges are usually, I get a lot of people who ask me what are kind of the go-to isopods for things. And a lot of times it's going to be your dwarf whites for some of your smaller stuff, maybe in a crested gecko enclosure, but even then I try to put in some bigger stuff, at least right now with my crested geckos, just so they can eat them. I actually have the Cuberis marina in there, but otherwise dwarf whites are also great because the crested geckos won't eat them, but they'll take care of some waste, or they'll eat less of them, at least because they're so small. But powder orange is really for a lot of the snakes. Even if you guys can run snake tubs, as far as you can run tubs bioactive, so you can put a few powder oranges in there as well as some springtails and have some good bioactive soil. I use actually the iso straight that we sell on Port City Pet, and then put a layer of leaf litter over it, and then you can put some springtails and powder oranges in there. The powder oranges are super hardy as far as temperature and humidity goes. So even if you do spray your snakes down or something that's high humidity, they're good with that. Even if you have something that dries out, that may only stay 40% humidity, they're pretty good with that as well. So that's why it's a good overall kind of go-to, especially for the snakes, because they're super active and they take care of a lot of waste, and they'll take care of sheds even. I still pull sheds after a while, but by the time I pull them, they're pretty picked apart by the isopods, which I think is pretty cool. But yeah, there's also some merch up there and stuff like that. I have an Eastern Black King snake still available. I have one male. I haven't really advertised that up at all, but if you guys are interested, feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, I really think that that's it. There's really not much else to talk about in this intro, but thank you guys so much for being there. Oh, thank you, Michael, in the comments. He got some clowns today from eBay. Thank you, first of all, for buying those clowns, and second of all, for coming out and checking out the podcast and checking out the live stream. I appreciate it. Other than that, you may know our guest by many aliases. You may know him as Bob Rock, Bobby Pebbles. You may know him as the Buddy Bear, the right-hand man to Morelia Python Radio, or Rob Stone of High Plains Herp. How are you doing?
I'm great, man. Thanks for having me. Finally bit the bullet on this video thing, so we'll see how it goes. I tried to convince you to do a slideshow instead of all the pictures that I sent you, but I don't know if we're going to be able to make that work.
I mean, I'll show some pictures, but I want to see your beautiful face first. I've been trying to convince Rob to be on here probably for I probably asked you first maybe 2 years ago or so.
Something like that. Certainly, I know I've been listening from the start, so you can ask me anything. I don't think there's any of yours. Eric and I were just talking the other day about how there's one particular one that I just haven't had the gut to listen to of his show. So it's kind of like you got to leave the set incomplete, right? You can't think that you've done it all. So there is one. But I think I've heard all of yours.
That is so. First of all, thank you, and second of all, I can't believe you stuck through those cringy first 50 of them.
I mean, half the time that's fun, especially in the moment, it's great, and then looking back on it 3 years later, it's really fun then.
Yeah.
With the benefit of hindsight of all the different things, it's sort of, the reason Owen really doesn't like that initial Scrub show is because it's my favorite show. There's no doubt that there's a, not only correlation, there's causation on that.
Well, and I don't have a Rob Stone, at least, to go through all my past stuff and pick out audio clips of me sounding stupid and replaying them, 3 years later. So I'm grateful, to be honest.
I mean, that one turned into a t-shirt, right? That I made up for Tinley. To me, that's, the Matlock's Python. That's, I think, what he really doesn't like about that.
Yeah, that's rough. Anyway, so
it's all good though. It's all up. That's the part that's so impressive with them, is just doing it week after week, as you can speak to, to do it for that time frame, that many episodes, that consistently. And I think that speaks to just, in terms of keeping animals and being successful, what that really means is being consistent. And so to me, that's just a prototype example of that, sort of effectuating that behavior, even when it's hard.
Yeah. And I think I think Eric talks about all the time that's like the one thing that Larry, I think from Reptile Radio, told him, is to be consistent. And he did that. And then I heard that from him. And now, I try to do that as best as I can. So it's kind of, I'm just taking after their lead. And yeah, man, it's crazy how consistent they've been over time. And hopefully I'll be right there with them too.
Yeah, man. For sure. And the funniest bit about Larry giving him that advice is that the first time that they didn't do it themselves, Eric has kind of built it in terms of taking 2 weeks off between Christmas and New Year's and whatever. But with Reptile Radio, they didn't do that the first 2 or 3 years. And maybe the way it had, the days fell, right? It didn't wind up really conflicting. So it was all good. And then at some point, there was a conflict, and they said, "Oh, well, we'll be back in 2 weeks," but it wasn't their regular plan to do that. And then, a week became 2 weeks, became a month, and then after that, it was very inconsistent. There were definitely more shows after that, but it wasn't the same. And then CK did some and stuff, and those were all good. But yeah, it really proved the point that it's like the first week that they didn't do it, then it went off schedule and became many weeks.
Yeah, I've felt that myself. Say if we didn't have someone booked, and I knew that if I took that week off, I would, it would get a little bit too comfortable. I may slack on the next week, and it just builds upon itself. But I thought
totally, man.
It's funny because I've been to Tinley with you. We've hung out quite a bit, but I have no idea how you first got interested in reptiles. How did this all come to be? Right.
Yeah, I'm not totally sure, but I can kind of walk through the highlights that definitely happened. And then, maybe there's some narrative to that. But when I was a little kid, I lived, all over the place, but sort of this first reptile related memory was being in Southern California. There's a pet store called the Pet Barn that, I guess, talking to Stan Grumbeck, who was distributing dog food, said still exists. I have my membership card over in the other room. I found it over the summer, something like that. And my old man was not a reptile person at all, but he liked animals. So we would go every week or every other week when I'm from 5 or 6 years old to this, pet store shaped like a giant barn that, as I say, evidently is still there. And just checking out all the stuff. He loved rats, rat pets. So we had rats as pets. We would, as a kid, at elementary school, take home all the things over Thanksgiving break, Easter, or, whatever break, summer break, to more and less success, depending on what it was. Hamsters tended to not go well. I think a couple of those might have met their maker, associated with him inadvertently throwing them into the wall or whatever when they bit him. Hamsters suck. Yeah. So, and certainly there was a bird incident, an unintentional bird incident, but in the Southern California sun, it was just making too much noise one weekend. One weekend morning, he'd put it out there to try and get some sleep and forgot about it in the sealed car. And that was the end of that story. We had to, quote, give away the bird and go, "Can I see it one last time?" "No, you certainly cannot." So there was that from real little. And then I moved to Hungary when I was 7, something like 6 or 7. And so I'd moved to Hungary, and I think this precedes, either way. So moved to Hungary, kept some small red-eared slider turtles there because they didn't have the 4-inch rule, so you could get the dime store turtles that you hadn't been able to get here since the mid-70s or whatever. So I had a whole gang, a half dozen of those in a tank. And when we had moved back, I had left them with someone else who worked for the newspaper that my folks had owned. And so that was, I think, my first reptile pet. around that same time, I had gone with a friend of mine to Italy. He had his father was actually an immigrant from Italy whose family still lived in Bari. And so one summer I went with him for the 4 or 5 weeks that they would go over every summer. And around the house, villa, whatever situation outside of Bari, there were all these wall lizards. And so we would capture them, try catching them and all this stuff and keep them for a day and then let them out and all this stuff. I don't think we inadvertently cooked any of them. That was mostly just a very short term, but kind of getting into the spirit of catching lizards in Italy. So I remember that. And then I'm trying to think what would have been next was probably Sean, who you have some contact with at Sean of EMS. I bought a leopard gecko from him at the first show that I went to here in Colorado. He used to have a whole variety of things. My old man wasn't going for a snake, so there was no corn snake in the offing for me. But the leopard gecko for $15 we went in on, and I had that for years. I actually kept it in this problematic. I don't know if you remember in the back of the Reptiles magazines around the mid to late 90s, they would have sort of this fixture that you would be sort of the land segment of a half water, half land situation. Yeah. But it wasn't the one that divided the tank in half. It was something that sort of this thing coming out of the water. So I kept it in there despite being a desert species or whatever. It did awesome despite being on an island surrounded by water. Up until the point that I had caught a little bluegill or sunfish locally and put it in there along with a crawdad. So it was a big aquarium, but I mean, north of it was probably 29, I think, with this. So it's half water and it's got this little fixture in there and of a leopard gecko, a bluegill, and a crawfish, which was all fine and well until one day the leopard gecko left its tail hanging in the water and it got removed by the bluegill. And then they wound up getting separated. So yeah, so that's far from ideal, but speaks to how resilient all those things are, is because they all lived then separately for several years.
That's a hilarious combination of animals.
It really is. It was pretty fantastic. And the interesting bit was that the tail must have been removed so problematically that despite being a leopard gecko where they grow back, it never grew back.
Whoa. And if you guys have ever seen, if anyone's ever gone fishing and those they'll eat anything.
Yeah.
They're savage.
And it got a tail. But I mean, that leopard gecko was the first thing that then several years down the line that I actually produced from. So, I mean, she lived an extra at least 8 or 9 years out of that, producing eggs consistently and doing great.
And how old were you at this time?
Probably from 10, something like that, 10 or 11. Yeah. So as I say, not ideal is sort of this circumstances that you have, and then you make a mistake where you say, "Oh, I caught this fish. Where could I keep this fish?" And somehow that's how it ends up. I did also get a pet store boa constrictor. My mother would go in for the reptile stuff, or the snake stuff, I should say. But it was the mall pet store, the imported baby Colombian boa that looks fine superficially, but I mean, it's also interesting with the knowledge that you have retroactively that it's like this thing had been born within 10 days to 2 weeks before I had gotten it. Maybe they had fed it once. It had been alive long enough to get infested with mites. And certainly keeping it a baby boa, a newborn baby boa, in a 20-gallon long with a heat rock on AstroTurf. None of these things. Right?
Oh, yeah.
Right. So it was all those, and being in a dry climate, and then having a screen top on a 20-gallon long for a newborn boa. The whole thing was a disaster. So it did not go well. But didn't dissuade me, and it's not what I would do now. I'm trying to think whether I suppose I have had a couple boas, at least, a couple boa constrictors for short periods of time. In terms of stuff, I think my buddy Tom, who works at the Denver Zoo, had got somebody brought in some baby boas, or medium, maybe half-size boas, something like that. But for the most part, I don't think I've had boa constrictor. That might be the only one that jumps to mind for sure. I know I
my
sold
buddy
James Lewis some.
Yeah. I don't know if you saw him in the
Lewis
chat.
some.
He said he bought a pair of adult Colombians in like 2005 or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking, so other than those, and a guy I worked with at Pro Exotics, Ollie, liked boas and had some. And I think maybe the ones that James got were ones from Ollie. And I don't know what they had, what the story was, but I think that's the ones that James got.
That's wild. And what really got you first interested in breeding them? Because I know at that time, I mean, there were people keeping them, and it was nice to see, animals when you went to the show and stuff, but not many people thought about breeding reptiles at that point.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it was kind of perfect timing in the sense of Reptiles magazine came out, and I think the first issue was 93 or 94, something like that. Vivarium had been out since 88 or 89. Although, admittedly, right, when you're an initial keeper and both things existed simultaneously, and that was back in the days when Reptiles magazine came out every month, and I think they were less pet focused, but that actually when they were both sort of in their peak, Reptiles had more of an appeal, and then there was Reptile and Amphibian Hobbyist, which was a small one, Fauna, which was a really nice printed publication. It was actually put out by a guy who I've subsequently met. He was the publisher of the first 4 issues or whatever. It was a great guy. Facebook, right? The Great Uniter. All these years later, but I did start by reading the Reptiles Annual magazine, and then the Reptiles Annual turned into Reptiles magazine, turns into Reptile and Amphibian Hobbyist, finding back issues of that the pet shop would have and that sort of thing. And then Vivarium magazine. But as I say, Vivarium actually, I have more of an appreciation for it now than I did at the time. I remember in the late 90s, early 2000s, right, when Vivarium was folded into Reptiles magazine, thinking, oh, maybe this is a good thing. And I would never say that now. Comparatively of the two, I strongly prefer the Vivarium magazine. I have the full set and all that. So it's clearly something that I value. But anyway, I think that was a really good time to get into it because the internet existed. There are people that I could go. I remember going on to kingsnake.com in 1997 and 1998 when it had first come out. So that was kind of right when it did. Yeah, I know everyone, I suppose if you came to it much later, then, that's funnier than it is if you, having been there from 97 or 98, I just have the same, comfort that Jeff Barringer has with it in the terms of saying, well, this is what it used to look like. I saw it when it first came out, and I don't mind that it looks the same now, whereas it's probably very dated. If that's not your exposure to it, it's
imagine kids who didn't grow up. Like I grew up at least in the forums and doing that, but now we have people who are old enough to buy reptiles on their own that have never experienced that. So that may be their first time on a forum in general.
Sure.
They're just like, what?
To me, the classified thing is certainly the most appealing bit of it, and the part that, in a certain way, feels least dated because it just sort of it meets the functionality. And I know, besides going to mobile versions and stuff, at this point, it sort of is the archetype of what we still do, right? In terms of all these things, sort of still have that outline. I know Morph Market is a little bit more rectangular boxes instead, right? It's working more vertically. You get these columns vertically instead of just going line by line horizontally. But as I say, if you're using it for that, I don't mind it. And it is the forums on King Snake that are really feel the age. Quite different.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I haven't checked that out in a while. But I
Right.
mean, what other things were you on back then? I mean, there had to have been other forums that you were interested in because I know that I mean, it got very niche as far as that goes.
Yeah, I mean, I none really jumped to mind beyond Morelia pythons. I know, so maybe when we're talking 2003, 2004, something like that, going on Morelia pythons. Actually, the ones that stick out in my memory were the Australian ones. So there was an Australian reptile finder one. I think that reptile trader maybe. So I remember going on there, seeing albino olive pythons and seeing, all this great stuff. And as people say, and I suppose again, this just sort of speaks to the time frame and this sort of thing of saying, oh, well, I never thought we would see those, right? Let alone roughies and that sort of stuff.
Yeah,
Although I did
absolutely.
see the, roughies back in 04 or 05 up at Terry Phillips' place. I'd gone with Tom, from the zoo to Reptile Gardens to do some venomous handling training stuff. And that was before he had produced them, but he had a couple of very big ones. Or at least, that's sort of how they stuck out. And this was preceded them being here to such an extent that even a picture, at the back of Reptile Gardens holding on to one of these things was a pretty sweet post that everyone was pretty jealous of.
No, I couldn't even imagine. I mean, just in my time in the last, 7 years or so, I mean, it's been a rare snake to the point where people, if you had one and you posted a picture up, people would go crazy about it. So I couldn't even imagine when there's probably two in the whole country.
Yeah, I mean, it was. I remember telling him, that we had talked about it at the time, and my instant reaction was, "Oh, okay, so it looks like a Western stem on sort of a chondrocarpet body with then the keeled scales of a lot of North American, a garter snake or a rattlesnake, something like that." And that was, my instant reaction is, wow, it's this weird oversized Western Stimson's python. But very beautiful, very cool. And certainly, I guess the other bit of that, right, is all through that time watching the Mark O'Shea content, Steve Irwin content. And I think that's part of the drive to go to Australia, right? I love all reptiles. I think about reptiles constantly. And I truly love Western terrestrial garter snakes that we have, here. They're one of my favorite snakes. There was an albino when I was in elementary into middle school. There's a theoretical spot, right, where there's a T-positive albino population that crops up every now and again. I'm not sure whether that within that subspecies, whether there's a non-Colorado variant that'll put that morph out there. I know people have had that morph, and certainly that's one that could be given away based on the laws of the state. You could give it away, and someone brought it into the school, and I wound up getting that one. But as a baby garter snake, ultimately, I think I kept it for 18 months or 2 years, and then ultimately that snake died. Unfortunately, it was not the only. As I say, it was not the only one. I know Scott Felser had some. I'm not sure whether those are from the same spot, so to speak. But someone just brought it into school. They found it in the window well or in their basement.
Wow.
Cool little snake. And, certainly that was, I guess, so this brings up in my mind another exposure when I was 10 or so and into reptile. Well, going back even further, and this will sound bananas to nowadays, but I remember being on a plane by myself. So I was 7 or 8 years old, and I was flying to see my grandparents in Cleveland. And I was on the plane next to someone who had a critter keeper with a corn snake in it. So I spent the whole flight, I don't even remember where I was going, what leg it was or where I was coming from or whatever. I guess California at that point. But the notion that you would spend a flight from California to Cleveland sitting next to somebody who's got a corn snake and a critter keeper, it's sort of bizarre at this point. But it was, I think that was a big hook. And then one of my mother's high school friends, who was a special education teacher in Cleveland, had a big boa in her classroom. And so somewhere there is a picture of me holding this quite large, a boa eating rabbits as a 7 or 8 year old kid, and it's draped around the neck, sort of the classic throttling the snake sort of picture as it's around your neck. So that was some exposure. And then as I was gonna go into in Belgium so when I lived in Hungary, my best friend was from Belgium. He had come. I went to the American school, so they spoke English, and my best friend had moved from Belgium and didn't speak any English, and he and I had hit it off despite him not speaking English at all. And subsequently, I moved back to the States, and he moved back to Belgium, and then maybe a year was missed or whatever, but every alternate summer, either he would come to the States or I would go to Belgium. And then at some point, his old man, we wound up going back to Hungary, just on a vacation from the vacation, right, so to speak. And his old man knew a commercial reptile breeder who lived outside of Budapest, Hungary. So we went to his place, and at this point, I'm probably 14, 15, something like that. And he had, all sorts of crazy stuff, up to and including all sorts of elapids and things. And I remember, he must have, thinking about it now, he easily must have had 300 breeder snakes, easily, of all manner and variety, just at his house.
And this guy was actually breeding? He wasn't just importing?
Oh, yeah. No, he's a legit dude, presumably. If he's still around on the earth, he's the sort of person like you and like me he certainly has reptiles. He might not have 300 at this point, but he would certainly have reptiles. So I'm sure he's still around. Unfortunately, I don't remember, his name or any sort of identifying information beyond that paltry amount. But I remember asking, and my buddy was terrified that I was going to ask him for a snake. But I just asked him for the shed of one of the elapids that he had, and he was happy to, as he's pulling the tubs open. And so I brought that back, and that was just so awesome. So cool. Right. Shortly thereafter, Pro Exotics had opened in Boulder, but it was in a commercial, like a warehouse type space where it wasn't open to the public. But I was local to me when they opened the retail shop so that you could come check it out and do all these things. And so I was there the day that it opened, all the way through the time that it had closed. I was there every week. At a point there, I did try and put my name in when I was 15 and a half to work there. Robyn's mother was the manager of the shop, and she and I didn't hit it off. And so I didn't, which then did lead to a humorous incident wherein I called and complained about his mother to him. But give me an ounce of credit in the sense that he didn't fight it. He didn't disagree. And I still came on board probably 18 months later. So,
I couldn't see you having trouble with anyone. I couldn't see you like having a conflict.
I don't have opinions about anything, and I don't, run my mouth at all, or not, whatever. But so that was good, and I wound up working there when I was in high school for a couple of years, and then I worked there after. So then I went to school at Tulane for a year, and then I came back to Colorado State, and kind of overlapping that time, my buddy Tom from the Denver Zoo and I started the company High Plains Herp. So together then when I had moved, I took my stuff to his place, and that was sort of the foundation point of the company. He and I then bought some stuff together. And then when I was at CSU, I would stay 2 or 3 nights a week at his house, which was about an hour's drive away, taking care of animals. And it was great, man. We got between all those things, all those experiences, trying most everything, within the realm of legitimate to keep, in the state and stuff. So that I guess too, when I was in high school, I volunteered at the Denver Zoo. And so that he and I became very tight out of that. And that sort of preceded what I was speaking about there.
And what did you do, just to bring it back a little bit? What did you do at Pro Exotics?
So the first time that I was there, I helped with, I'm trying to think. So the first time it was the Gila monsters and beaded lizards, which was a lot of those animals, sort of the cool room, which entailed those. There were some pyros in there. There were mandarins. There were coxi. There was the bolins were in there, in the crazy stacked cages that everyone talks about. So I think those were the principal focus. And so that was in commercial space again, that vented to the outside so we could suck in 40-degree air. But yeah, so Gilas, beadeds, bolins, and then sort of helping out, as necessary on other things. It wasn't super tight. I would help Jimmy feed all the monitors, do all that stuff, which was very cool. It gave me exposure to Mertens monitors. Now, one of my two favorite monitors, based on that exposure. They're not easy to keep in a house setup because they do want water, but meaning a big water feature fixture. Yeah, so that was kind of the first time. Then the second time, I took care of all the Asian rat snakes and did all the rodents there. And again, helping with Gilas, beadeds, some ball python stuff. There was, some percentage of them were mine to take care of. But yeah, I mean, my focus was the rodents and the Asian rat snakes. And I guess the other bit too is around 2003, Tom and I bought all of the rhino rat snakes from Pro Exotics. They were having trouble getting blisters on them, which I have some thoughts on at this point, but they wound up having to euthanize quite a few. And then Tom and I together bought all of the rest, which I think was about 5 pair of at least juveniles, including some adults, and maybe some extra babies and stuff. But so yeah, that was my start to those. And again, I'd seen them at the shop and things, and those had been unavailable to me. Certainly, I didn't have an extra many thousands of dollars to get into them or whatever. But Tom and I made that work. I think we wound up selling a pair or two at Daytona that year. That allowed us to pay for the project by selling 1 or 2 pair. And then we've kept them, collectively. Certainly I've kept and produced them, I think, every year since 2000. I think I got them in 2000. It's tough to say. I don't remember whether I produced them in 2003 or not, but if not, since 2004, and they're the only species that I've had consistently that entire time. I've always had at least a handful since then.
What were they going for when you first started breeding them?
So that's the interesting bit, is that they've actually stayed remarkably consistent. I don't remember I think we paid about $1,000 a pair for all of them. So whatever that total wound up being, 5 pair plus whatever else. And then basically the entirety of the time that I've produced them, they've sold for $750 a pair, which is pretty weird when you can compare it to almost anything else. They've been remarkably a consistent price the entirety of the time that I've had them.
But also, who besides you has bred them every year since 2003?
In the United States, I'm not aware of anyone.
Right. So as I was saying, I don't think the supply is getting out of control. I mean, it's mostly you.
Yeah. 100%. And especially there are a couple quirks to them, so that I think people have been, generally speaking, more successful now than they were previously. And until 2010, Tom and I got some wild caught ones that Cameron brought in, which was kind of a funny story in itself, from China. From China in 2005. But other than those, we really didn't see more come in until 2009 or 2010. And even then, very small numbers. We're talking maybe 6 to 10 animals at a time, once or twice a year, something like that. Yeah, so certainly that's had an influence, but they are a little bit weird to breed relative to a corn snake. You know, if you just treat them as a corn snake in terms of how you pair them and then saying, oh, okay, the female is developing these follicles and she'll be good to go. If you pull them out at that time, you're probably going to get slugs or nothing. And I know going back to 2003 or 2004, Kathy Love had rhinos and didn't have any success. And with the knowledge that I have now, I think that's probably what they were doing, is they were treating them like corn snakes. And they're in some ways similar. Certainly they're extremely hardy. They're very calm snakes, but I think that if you just treat them that way in terms of trying to breed them, you won't have a ton of success.
So that first group that you got, were all those just long established captives as far as they were basically wild caught?
They had gotten the first ones that Cameron brought in from Klaus Schultz back in 90. So they were either 97 or 98 animals. I need to totally nail down the history on this, but certainly Klaus was one of the first people to produce them. I think Nikolai Orlov, Tula, Exoterium, I think they were probably the first to produce them. And I'm not sure whether they sent Klaus some wild animals or exactly how that is nailed down. I know Sergei Ryabov, Nikolai Orlov were involved in terms of, from Tula, Russian Academy of Sciences, were involved with going in 94 and 95, doing field expeditions at Tam Dao, Vietnam, which is northwest of Hanoi, that mountainous region there. So they had gone, and as far as I know, the captive specimens that came out of those collecting expeditions in 94, 95, so again, kind of the communist connection, right, presumably was facilitating that, although there were American academics on those trips, kind of facilitated some of that. They're never really a species that's been exported from Vietnam for the pet trade, as far as I'm aware. I'm not aware of any that have actually come out of Vietnam explicitly for that purpose. The Vietnamese ones we see now are descendants of those wild animals that were collected on those scientific expeditions. So the first ones were associated with that, and they came into the U.S. in 98, maybe mid-98, something like that. And Pro Exotics had bought all of them, as far as I know, save maybe Fort Worth Zoo got some. Fort Worth got some, Denver got some, and the rest went to Pro Exotics. So kind of all the private trade ones had gone to them. And it's not, as I say, so it's not totally clear to me whether all of those were the stuff from Klaus. Certainly the ones that Pro Exotics had were the Fort Worth ones, and Denver ones might have had some influence from other wild-caught ones that had come through Tula. And then Tula would send stuff to Cameron through sort of the mid-aughts every year. And I got those as well. There were several years where I wound up buying 30 of them or whatever that would come from Tula, just to make sure that I could kind of manage what was going on instead of having them go to random jobbers and stuff and then seeing those just get mixed in. To be honest, it was less about controlling a market than it was kind of mixing in different things and maintaining the best bloodlines that the most genetically diverse bloodlines that we possibly can. More than anything, saying, hey, let me mix a pair from this Tula, maybe they're F2 from wild-caught Tula stuff with one of these Klaus things, and then with the Chinese wild-caught, descendants of the Chinese wild-caught stuff that I had produced.
So is there some type of desirability between Vietnam or China? Like, what are the different localities, or what is going on? Which one's more desirable?
Sure. I think there's traits that we see out of the lines of animals, but I don't think there's an inherent difference in terms of locality stuff. All the wild rhinos that you see tend to have less black and white visible, but I think that's more a product of, so they tend to be more uniformly green snakes. And if anything, they show the color-based sexual dimorphism more than captive stuff does. But they're, in terms of the Tamdao to Gwangju, the entire range of these snakes is very tight. So there's not, and there's, as far as I'm aware, there's not really any genetic, barriers to gene flow that would cause a unique look. Supposedly, specimens exist that retain at least one that they saw that was sort of a larger animal. Whether that means, I haven't seen a picture. I don't have the information beyond saying mention has been made of 2.5, 3 footers that are still gray. But I think it's all referencing probably the same snake, and what that actually looked like, I don't know. I've never seen a picture. I can't really speak to it other than saying I know the literature references that as maybe being possible. Out of hundreds that I've seen, I've never seen it. But again, I've reached a point in my life where I'm plenty willing to admit and own and even speak up to things that I don't know. So I can't, certainly there's a reference to it. It's not from nothing, presumably, but what it actually means, I don't know.
Yeah. And what was at that time when you were you were working with these rhino rats and all that? I mean, were you thinking of doing this full time at all? I mean, was that ever a thought?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose so. Certainly when there was a year, I think 2006, that Tom and I sold quite a few animals. The only bummer of it was that, we had paid Cameron almost as much as we had made. So we sold, I don't know, almost $100,000 worth of reptiles, but we had paid almost that same amount, between all these things, a lot of that coming from Cameron. But the cool bit of that was just the exposure to, going out when the crates, the shipments would come in and seeing stuff before anyone in the United States had seen those, save the inspectors or whatever, if they had opened that crate. And picking out blood pythons and annulated boas from Quetzal. That there was one that must have been a Chimaera. So this little annulated boa that was half the dark phase and half orange phase in a weird mixture pattern, not one of these split head ones that, I mean, that pretty clearly is what it was. It was just the opposite of identical twinning, right? Where two snakes become one snake in development. But it was a very, very pretty snake that ultimately Jeff Murray wound up with, but I don't think it ever wound up producing. And being a Chimaera, maybe that has something to do with that. But it was a very stunning snake. So getting the opportunity to work with all those different things, baby Tannenbar pythons, captive hatch Tannenbar pythons. What I think, based on talking to Daniel Natouche now, maybe were the first captive bred Hera pythons. So back in January or February of 2005, I got 2 really small Hera pythons, a pair that I was obviously super enthused about, but they weren't red. And everyone said, oh, well, they can't be babies, even though they're the size of newborn carpet pythons, because they're not red. Well, now Oklahoma City and subsequently Chuck Poland have shown that, well, they're not born red. So I wasn't wrong. They fit on the top of a 4-inch, they completely coiled on top of a 4-inch terracotta planter base. And I'm like, okay, I don't know how old what size you think they're born at, but I'd imagine this is pretty close to it. Anyway, so that they were just sold as whatever as they were. I don't think there was really any information tied to it. But in Daniel Natouche's paper, where he talks about all the stuff going on at the farm and things, he mentions having measured Hera python eggs, and the timing of that, combined with sort of that being funneling all that stuff to Cameron and the stuff that we've seen, I think those are probably the snakes that hatched that were associated with that. So that was super cool. And I had those snakes for quite a while. I ultimately sent them to my buddy Bill Hughes in Tennessee, who then sent them back to me. And I had them for another quite a few years. Ultimately, the female inadvertently killed the male, that clutch mate, she bit him in a feed response, and I think wound up messing up his internal structure so that when he ultimately ate, it didn't pass right. And then I had a male drown himself by pinning himself with his head upside down in a water bowl. And then she caught 2 really big tumors. So, 13 years later or whatever, they wound up all having passed away. But yeah, super cool animals. And I'm glad to have tried those things. It's always interesting, right? There's a discouragement to trying different things, because if you try different things and you find that you don't like them, then you sell them, and people conceive of that as then you're a flipper, this sort of thing, or you get sort of this reputation. And that's really a bummer, because to my mind, you should try things and then figure out what you like. You can't know if you'll like it until you try it. Simultaneously, I understand not trying a dozen things simultaneously. And I think the real key, and I've been certainly guilty of this myself, particularly 15, 20 years ago, is that the initial shine, right, can make you sort of run your mouth about, oh, these are the best, and then you look a little silly when 3 months later you're talking about selling them and stuff. So, maybe try things, but try them in moderation, and then be open to the fact that they could be awesome, but maybe just not awesome relative to what you enjoy.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there ever really, though, like a sweet spot for you as far as, does it always come to Asian rat snakes, or, rare pythons? What is really your niche?
I don't know. I think where I'm at now, I'm actually pretty content. Although I did just buy the first snakes that I bought in a year, from Tim Gebhardt, who you probably know, Vivid. He had an update to his list, and I happened to see it and caught me at the right time. So he has those Depai that he's got that hypo project associated with those. And when he had first put those out, I had happened to see it because I think he had inadvertently made public sort of his operating page that he didn't intend to make public. And I think that was probably 3 or 4 years ago. So I had seen those, and those really impressed me. But he didn't have a ton of availability, essentially any availability, and they were quite expensive. So this past weekend, he had sent out his availability update, and I saw those Depai, and I said, yeah, those would be cool. I've had Janai, but I've never had Depai. So I'm excited to try those.
I did not expect you to say Pituophis at all, or anything North American.
Yeah, man. So I like all sorts of things. To answer your question more specifically, no, I think there's probably things that I like in basically every group. Some of those I can keep, some of them I can't. So I keep what I can and don't keep the other stuff. But I actually save sort of that purchase. I'm really content with what I have now, which is a mixture of things: West Indian boas, the Solomon Island tree boas, the rhinos. Still doing great with those. And but if you said, hey, give me a North American colubrid, I have North American colubrids that I really like. That doesn't, heck, it was only maybe 2.5 years ago, I had moved away from keeping a lot of snakes in racks. It certainly has a purpose, and it's not against doing that. I still have racks now, but just in terms of, I found, I have, 120 snakes or something like that, and I really like interacting with 40 of them. Well, despite the fact that those other 80 are important to me in some way, either important to me, important to the population of people interested in those, or both things, they're not, in sort of that top 40. So would it make more sense to get some cages and really be able to enjoy to the fullest those things that I really like? And so I did. I sold a lot of stuff that were important things to me. Rubber boas. I had a lot of Theri are a snake that I really like. I had 40 of them, 45 of them, something like that. Alterna snakes that I really like. I had almost as many Alterna as I did Theri. And I would get, Brian box, so pure locality, either F1 or in some cases F2 stuff that are really locality tight. I love locality Alterna. The Theri were really cool because despite having 40 or 45 of them, I could tell which one each one was because they all look different. So those are great. Those are probably my two favorites. We'll see how the Depi are. Certainly they're beautiful. I think have a thing for snakes that look like 3 or 4 snakes stapled together.
Yeah, it is always nice when the tail looks completely different from the head, looks completely different from the midsection of the animal.
Yeah, 100%. Heck, I mean, I don't keep any, but I love bull snakes. I love finding bull snakes. They're one of the first snakes that I would, in my area, they're one of the few snakes that you'd see consistently. So I've probably seen, not this hits another, jump from soapbox to soapbox, right? But I do like finding them in the wild. I think they're all beautiful. Certainly some are different, than others, but it's the bummer of seeing field herpers on Instagram, right? I would say, I've seen, I don't know, 2 or 3 dozen or something over my time, which is not that many. But if I were to say that on Instagram, I'd have some 18-year-old field herper say, I found that many yesterday or some bullshit like that. And it's sort of, well, that's fine. You can do what you want, man. Like, I have a wife and a daughter and work and, all these things. And it's like, I can't drive to Baca County at the drop of a hat at this point in my life.
Yeah, I mean, how dare you? I mean, you're someone who we go to Tinley and we see something on a table and I'm like, what the hell is that? And you're like, yeah, I've had those before. Type of, like, you've kept pretty much everything, man.
Yeah, and which, again, some of it for a week or 2 weeks, and some of it for, rhinos going, 18 years or whatever, and most stuff somewhere in between. But I think all reptiles are cool. They're not necessarily something that makes sense for me to keep or that I would even enjoy keeping, but that doesn't mean I don't love seeing them. I found my first yellow belly racer, which again was that isn't a hugely common one to find here, but that's your first one, 15 years in or whatever. Yeah, I guess, but it was pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, and you've gone and you've traveled all over the place as far as herping goes. Well, Australia in particular, but I mean, have you gone anywhere else herping that we may not know about?
No, well, so I've been to quite a few places. I haven't been to Africa. I've been to Turkey. I was just having a conversation yesterday about that. That's the closest that I've been. I've been to Turkey a handful of times, which is great. I maybe wouldn't suggest going now in the same vein as Hungary of like, well, maybe now is not the time to go, but it is a very cool place. The people are great. I've been to Kyrgyzstan, which should have some interest. I think you even get Elafi, the get Diones rats over there, which are another species that I like that we don't really see. And if you're into locality stuff, there's so much cool locality Diones that could be done. It doesn't really exist. It exists more in Europe than it does here. But to that point, I sent Matt most all my locality Diones and color morph Diones and that sort of stuff. Those are cool. So
those came from you?
The ones that Matt has?
Yeah.
Most of that stuff came from me. Yeah.
Because I've been like freaking out about those, especially like those really high red ones that he has.
Yeah.
So are those as easy to keep as they seem to be?
Yeah, they're not. Well, so the one sort of weirdness, they're not big snakes for the most part. There is, and I forget which locality it was. There is one that grows bigger. I think there's a relatively southern Chinese locality that gets pretty big, and maybe one of the Russian ones gets big too. But for the most part, they're really small snakes. They're cool. I did not have the locality where this was the case, but there is a locality where the eggs develop so long in the female that they hatch in like 10 days once they're laid.
Wow. And that's just, but that doesn't typically happen. That's a locality thing. Like, what's
Yeah,
the
it's a
difference
specific.
between the other animals? I mean, what's the typical period?
More typical would be at least a month, something like that. But and they're sort of, you know how you get windows on hognose eggs. The entire egg sort of looks like that, especially on those that hatch in 10 or 12 days or whatever. They like the whole egg looks like a window.
So it's almost like, when you see boas come out in the embryonic sacs
Yeah,
and it's all, I
it's
mean,
not
that's
quite as
basically what
tight.
it is, but
A little firmer than that, but it's obviously, yeah, to the point you're making. It's probably one of those that's evolutionarily, closer to the middle than most things are.
that's wild. So, and how do you keep them? I mean, Asian rat snakes, obviously everyone thinks cooler. What do you do with those guys?
Yeah, I mean they're like corn snakes, man. Like I didn't worry about those things at all. The only thing is they do have some. They can occasionally have these really caustic defecation. Really more of a I don't know if urination is right in terms of how they do it, but it's sort of they can make it pretty nasty, sort of a la blood python, right? Where not on that same sort of irregular schedule, but in terms of I've seen it before where it's just like, oh man, this is super caustic. And that would be the stuff where if you have too many snakes and you wind up then, or you're out of town or whatever. And so you're a little bit late on that. You might get some skin stuff out of having left them 2 or 3 days exposed to that. So that's kind of one peculiarity, just to be sure that you're keeping them extra clean. But I mean, for the most part, they're pretty standard. I didn't
Is
keep
that
them
something,
exceptionally cool.
is that something that goes beyond just, I mean, you obviously said it about these, you said about the rhinos, but like some sort of skin issue, does that happen with a lot of the old world rats?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose certainly the porphyracia are like that. They're relatively delicate. The interesting bit with rhinos is that their skin is actually really super resistant to sort of everything but the teeth of their same species. That's the only thing I've really seen cause real problems. But yeah, if you keep them too wet, that's an issue. But as I said, I mean, if you take a shed from a rhino and you try and pull it apart, it's actually remarkably difficult. And I've seen things in terms of feeding live and that sort of stuff where you have a rodent literally bite on, and it is rather than puncturing the skin, it's pulling away from the body and giving sort of this. You're seeing the interstitial stuff, and you see this rodent really working it, and you're freaking out naturally, and then trying to intervene and all this stuff again, younger days and mistakes and all this stuff. But it's remarkably resilient skin to everything but a male biting them. I've seen females get really torn up. In fact, in one of those pictures that you pulled up previously, you can see a wound on the female's posterior third from being paired with a male. There's occasionally you'll get males that are just too overly aggressive, and I've had it before, and that was actually one. The clutch wound up getting good fertility and things, but you'll be in a situation where it's like, I don't know whether this is enough to get a good clutch from this animal, but I just can't leave them paired up anymore because the male is just so aggressive.
So what
yeah,
is
as I
this
say,
behavior like? Do they latch on? I mean, like we see in some king snakes, or what are they doing?
yeah, but they're doing that all across their body, and their dentition is such that somehow it's causing. I've seen it, not in terms of being. I've seen the aftermath where it looks like literally you took a razor blade to the other snake, to the female. I think some of the growths that people see on these are associated with I don't think have the ability to really store fat in the way that we do, so they kind of improperly store it as these sort of, for lack of a better word, pustules or something like that. But think bigger and less, more of a cutaneous bump than you would think of like a pimple or something like that. And I had one female, and this is the female that very season wound up laying the most eggs I've ever gotten from 117 eggs in a clutch. That I fed her a lot of food, and coming out of that season, she developed one of these sort of subcutaneous bumps, maybe 4 or 5 inches down from her, the base of her neck. And I was like, oh, okay, well, what about this? So the first day that I put the male in there, she had it. And the next morning I came down and she had across that spot what looked like, you'd taken a razor blade to it. And the litter of the cage had this weird dark brown staining on it that clearly had come out of that. And yeah, just the notion that, look, that's what it looked like. It had the teardrop shape if you took a razor blade to something.
Whoa. Interesting.
And as I said, one of those that you posted up there where she's on eggs, you can see it on her. There's a spot at that point, I think, well, it's not post shed, but it's showing healing and stuff. And now she looks fine. I've never had a problem with it not healing right. But the male that I have her paired with now looks relatively similar to her. He's showing blue and things that make them look pretty close. But I can tell which is which because she has that scar on her back from the other male.
So I've actually been going through the pictures trying to find that, and I'm not sure if this is it.
Yeah, it's this one. Yeah.
Yeah, it's that guy right there, that scar. Is that a scar?
Yeah, sort of that bump on or that, raised maybe inch or so.
Yeah, man.
So that was I think 2 or 3 seasons ago. But yeah, so that is fairly common with those. And my advice to people is always sort of the same in the sense of, well, you just need to play it by ear. I do have one other interesting thing to say about that picture. But my advice to people is to play it by ear, and you might reach a point where you say, whether this means I don't get eggs from this pair this year or not, I just can't leave them together. And that did happen. In this instance, as soon as we're talking about a wound like that, it's, well, for me, they're coming apart, whether that means I don't produce from them or not.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to say, do you notice how the eggs are kind of enveloped, or they're stacked in an interesting way?
Yes.
They're like 2 levels, and they're all sort of seated one on top of the other. It gets a little sloppy, right? On the far right when you're looking at the picture, but that's actually characteristic of them to lay sort of eggs so that they're 2 levels deep, stacked perfectly on top of one another, and then they wind up being this sort of packet of eggs. And it's even remarked on in the literature and stuff from the very first clutches they were seeing. It's far from unique to her. It's very commonplace. It's much more strange. It's only when you get maybe over. The average clutch size is probably 6 to 8, and it's only when you start getting really over those numbers that you'll see more irregularities. I think one of the other egg pictures that you have in the thread, it's a little bit looser because I think there was 13 or 14 eggs there.
Yeah, and is that some type of? Do you have any idea where they would lay their eggs in the wild?
I'm thinking it's probably similar to what you're seeing there, where it's in that hollow,
and like this cork tube.
And so those are a little bit stacked, but because of the circumstance of the environment, they're not super neatly stacked, but you can see some of the same thing going. That's a very blue female. So she's probably an F2. She's a first generation descendant of those original pro-exotics animals. So she's a 2011. She was the last year that I bred the female that then survived until she was 18 or 19 years old. And her clutch mate original male. So she's a Klaus Vietnamese blue, quote, blue line. And you can see maybe why I would say that she's quite blue.
She is very blue. Yeah, man, that's amazing. And you can't really go wrong, even if it is green. Shit.
Yeah, and they definitely, so there's some, I don't think it's a locality thing, as I say. I think it's related to particular snakes, but You do have lines that tend to be more blue, and then all of the females will go through, when they have clutches, will go through sort of the hormonal blue thing you see in chondros. So that, I mean, she would be blue anyway, but then add on 4 or 5 clutches or whatever, and that makes her particularly so.
And are these animals, I mean, can they double clutch?
No, I've never double clutched them. And part of that is that their process takes much longer, at least the way that I keep them and in my conditions. I know a European guy I was saying, oh, well, on the rhino rat group on Facebook, I had posted up saying, oh, I have a couple females that are just now developing follicles and things. And that's sort of normative to my time frame, in terms of seeing eggs typically between late May through June, somewhere in that range. Although last year I got 3 clutches and the entirety, it was humorously, I suppose, wasn't super convenient for me. All of them were when I was at Eric's spot for Carpet Fest. I had 3 clutches from the 3 that I had paired up, and it was one day, the next day, and then 2 days later. So that I was at Eric's house and my wife had to pull all 3 clutches, much to her chagrin.
Yeah, she
But speaking of, it was okay. She made it. She did okay.
That's good.
Yeah, it's funny that, it speaks to the timing of the room, right? And having animals that are cycling together, that the 3 clutches that I got were within a 4 or 5 day range.
Yeah. I mean, and do you brumate these, or how exactly does that work?
Yeah, so I've tried all the different things that you can do. I know at Denver Zoo, they used to keep them in the warm area, so in the temple section in this warm area, and they would produce them without brumating them, which presumably was exposure to, there was temperature fluctuation, but not a super cool, not hitting a super cool temperature, but also just having, I think there were 2 pair in that same enclosure, which is interesting because typically males don't do well, but that speaks to having them in a 6 foot 6 foot by 4 foot sort of cute rectangle or whatever, such that the males, I guess that was enough space for them to tolerate one another, whereas they wouldn't in a tub for sure. That you definitely is sort of in the python, again, sort of how they're somewhat have some python tendencies. If you put 2 of them together, you're gonna notice. They're gonna chase each other around, and there's biting and stuff like that as well.
Wow. So do they like straight up combat, like with biting, if you put 2 males together?
Yeah, I've not yet seen it where you have sort of 2 males that will. What happens more typically is you have one that clearly, it's kind of more clearly established that one would be dominant, so the other is just trying to get away, rather than having to really compete. It's more one attacking and chasing and the other around. It's sort of how I've seen it presented, than the python thing. But definitely in terms of, if you toss them together and you hear a lot of noise, that's probably not a great sign.
Yeah. And I know that you've probably covered this extensively in an episode of NPR, I'm sure, as far as getting babies started and everything like that. So I want to refer everyone to that if they want to listen to, like the.
Sure. Yeah. I've over 18 years or whatever, my views have changed somewhat. And that's stumbling into another soapbox, man. But just to round off the point of what you had raised, nowadays I keep them basically like diamond pythons in terms of letting them get down to whatever the room goes down to. They're at the bottom of the room, and maybe the room will get to the low 60s or so, and they don't have supplemental belly heat. I'll put a spotlight on them, and I run all the lights on a cycle throughout the year, so that they have 8 hours of light in December, January, and then come June, July, they have 13 hours of light. And so they can get access to heat to raise their body temperatures up, but they mostly don't during the winter when it's at its coolest. But theoretically, they would have access to that. That's what I do now. If you're going to properly brumate them, I would say, if you're not giving them the potential to warm up, You probably don't want to go much cooler than 50. So if there's not fluctuation to it, if it's just a static sort of 48 or 50, that's probably not great. If it will warm up into even the mid 50s or 60, maybe not every day, but with some level of regularity, you can get away with, they'll be active at 38 degrees. Wow. Like they'll poke out and give you a look and stick their tongue out, and they look like a Gonyosoma oxycephalum, where they'll stick their tongue out and then, sorry, the camera thing's throwing me off. So they stick it out and then they sort of wag it up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down so that it's out of their mouth for 8 or 10 seconds. And then they pull it back in slowly, which is a behavior you see in oxycephalum kind of normatively and Jansseni normatively. But it's weird. They don't usually do that, but they will at 38 or 40 degrees. But if you just put them in a wine cooler at that temperature for 2 months, you're probably going to see neurological problems out of them. I don't think they stay consistently that cold where they're from.
And then after that period, I mean, are they spring breeders?
Yeah. I mean, so the only difference is just generally speaking, the female, they take longer to develop follicles than you see in corn snakes or other kind of standard colubrids. And the follicles get huge before they're ovulated, so that they look gravid and they haven't even ovulated, and they look like, man, this thing could lay a week from now. And then they'll do weird things where in terms of sheds, where they'll shed they'll have a pre-ovulation shed, and then so you're sitting there waiting on eggs, and you've pulled the male, but they haven't even ovulated yet. And if the male wasn't in there recently enough, then they'll wind up either slugs or nothing. And that was what I was alluding to with Kathy and stuff. And I think she owns that, I know from talking to her at the time, she was like, yeah, it's just not, in terms of all the stuff she had going on, it didn't make sense to do them. And it is a weirdness to them. It's not even not reading the snakes. You're looking at the snake saying, man, this thing should lay eggs 10 days from now. But in fact, I've had it where you could say that, and then we're talking about 2 sheds away from actually laying eggs.
Wow. So yeah, that definitely is very different. And I mean, I know that the babies are tricky, and like I said, it's probably been covered before, so please check that out. But can you give us just a quick overview on how to get babies started out of the egg?
Yeah, sure. I mean, to me at this point, and this follows, so the European keepers, generally speaking, tend to be pedantic and just sort of cultural norms in terms of how you might express yourself or whatever can make them come off very strongly to sort of American keepers and how we perceive things, especially in the context of online, where you're not actually engaging someone in a conversation. Although, as I say, to that point, I've had those interactions where you say, okay, well, you would say that to someone's face, it's not just, oh, you're a keyboard warrior. No, you would say that to someone's face, and you're just willing to let it play out. But I would say that sort of my own views have shifted in that direction, so that a lot of the thought process there is to start stuff more naturally than maybe, we have an obsession with feeding things domesticated rats or mice, and that's, if it's not eating those things, it must be broken. And that's that's where we get into the soapbox conversation, right? Of if we're talking about something where it's a multi-generation captive bred animal, and the majority of a given litter or clutch will accept a domesticated rodent, well, then the standard there, to me, is different than something like a Oxybellus or an Ayatula that, eats lizards, right? There's a Langaha, right? Where it's like, well, the reason that they don't exist for the most part in herpetoculture is because that's what they eat in the wild, and they're unwilling to take other things, or they don't, physiologically, they're just that we can't override, tens of thousands of millennia, hundreds of thousands of millennia, whatever it might be, of evolution, and have them successfully eat rodents and do well on it. Hognose, clearly you can. It's pretty clear that they might not eat rodents in the wild, but they can, eat a moderated diet of rodents and do well.
They can
Langaha,
survive 8
probably
years and
Yeah,
do okay.
Right. Even then it becomes, to the point that you raise, it's like, well, what is our definition of long, long-term success? And it probably isn't sufficiently long to actually account for some of this stuff. But, working with newborn baby Alterna, it's like different things are differentially suited, right, to taking rodents or rodent parts and starting that way. Baby Alterna are easy to feed mouse tails, hopper mouse tails. They're the right size to not force, but rather, because there's a key difference between assist feeding and force feeding something. Force feeding, it's just going in one way or another. Assist feeding, essentially you trick them into eating it, right? You start it and then they eat it of their own volition. And the difference in how something does between those two things is, in my experience, huge, right? If it's assisted in the sense of you start it and then it will eat it, it will willingly accept it. Those things tend to do okay. And like baby Alterna, baby variable king snakes, their body form, the form of their mouth and neck and all, is very well suited to doing that. So those, I'd probably feed them that. If as long as they're willingly assisting, they'll probably do fine, and they'll eventually switch to pinks. And for the most part, I found that to be the case. 95% of baby Alterna and Thera, that'll happen if you start them. If they won't just take a pink, give them tails, give them a handful of tails, and then they probably will take a pink. Baby Solomon Island tree boas, it's a bad idea. So then we get into the spot where I'll just feed them a lizard. Rhinos, I used to try tease feeding all of them, with pink heads and stuff like that. And some of them, it'll work. Some of them are willing to bite, and then they'll bite and hold on. And if you kind of stay still, go catatonic, they go catatonic, and then kind of wake up with it in their mouth and they eat it. But the percentage of them that do that seems to maybe vary by line and clutch and how many generations they are. With some of the F1 stuff, they just won't even bite for anything. Or they'll bite and they just will not hold on to it at all. They throw it out of their mouth constantly. And so when you have that, if you put in a tadpole or a fish, they'll just eat that. And I've transitioned as a keeper to saying, okay, is it about me or is it about the snake? And if you have a snake that's willing to do that and then graduate into eating maybe floated pinks out of that, I take that approach now. It's not good for me or the snakes to be stressing about trying to get them to eat something else. I tend to feed them what's available to me, which is, minnows if they won't take pinks.
Can you explain a floating pink real quick?
Yeah. So sort of the standard approach, you toss in I hatch out rhinos. I'm going to offer them all live pinks. And if those that don't take them, I'll probably try live pinks again. If they don't take those, then I'll put live fish in the water bowl. Typically, maybe you could get super small goldfish, but more commonly it's minnows, rosy reds. I suppose and again, that's an availability thing. If you breed guppies, great. If you breed Dendrobates auratus and don't mind feeding them tadpoles, those aren't going to have any toxins in them. That's an accumulative thing associated with being in the wild and stuff. So you could feed them those if you wanted to. That would, I think, make a ton of sense. That'd be perfect. But unless you're producing them for yourself and sort of where you're at, it would make sense to potentially feed out a $20 or $30 frog if you let it grow up. Then that's on you. If you're happy to do that, I think that would make a ton of sense. But I know historically people talk about zoonotic disease transfer, relevant to today. And I don't even know if we should go into that. But I think a lot of the talk about, fish are super dirty and all this stuff. You're just getting fish from PetSmart. Some of the time, I think we as reptile people wind up making excuses that sound good, that suit what we want to do anyway. It really is a question of us doing what we want to do. And then we've come up with a justification that claims something else, so that it's not saying, I do X because that's, because it suits my needs. Instead, there's some grander purpose to what we're doing. And I think, to me, the fish thing is that. So anyway, I would offer them live fish in their water bowl. And generally speaking, they respond really aggressively to that. Again, speaking to what they're programmed to do, it's few and far between that you would have a baby rhino that wouldn't take fish or tadpoles from the bowl. Then gradually, with size, interestingly, in the wild, they do eat rodents. Those 94, 95 studies in Vietnam found gut contents to show that they do eat rodents with size. So there will come a point where they will willingly transition to rodents. It's not necessarily age, it's seemingly size, and presumably that correlates to a size where they could find suitable prey that they could eat. An interesting point while we're there is you will see, if you're seeing that your snakes sit in their water bowls, you're probably feeding them too much, because they're sort of like people in that, when you're in water, you're more buoyant and you feel your own weight less. So I've seen it myself. Females tend to soak more than males, generally speaking, but I can't tease that apart from the fact that you tend to feed females more. And certainly even in my hatchlings, when they're taking pinks and stuff, they have a tendency for the first day, day and a half, 24 to 36 hours to sit in their water bowl. Presumably they're doing that to alleviate some of the pressure on their belly in terms of the size of the meal that they've eaten. I think it's very tightly tied to that in terms of little stuff that I've seen. And I don't see them soaking, my adults, I don't see soaking in the water bowl the way that I used to when I used to feed them a lot more.
Wow. So, and is that something to say with like not being used to that prey at them too? I mean, fish is probably such a small, lean meal in comparison.
Right. Yeah, I think that's probably right. In terms of when we think of we see it with blackheads and womas and stuff, right? That eat, particularly blackheads that eat eat reptiles in the wild and very few rodents. The amount of the caloric package, right, especially relative to size that they're getting from a reptile, a goanna, is going to be much lower than it is on a lab-raised rodent for sure.
Now, I mean, there's another picky eater that you kind of you alluded at earlier, and that I know that you're into these days. But when did you first get into or see your first Candoya?
I think the first Candoya that I had was a viper boa, maybe from Cameron, that came in as one of these, they get the tannins in there leaching into their outer skin so that when they shed out, they look fantastic. And it had come in and it was obviously a red snake. You could look at the ventral scales and it was a very red snake. So I had gotten that in 2005 or 2006. And then I don't even know if it needed to shed before someone threw a bunch of money at me to get it. So it either had one shed with me or did not, because it was clearly a correct purchase from a commercial standpoint. The next one that I had, I got from Ryan Burke in 2015, I think, and it was a 2014. So the Solomon Islands were closed to exportation kind of throughout the late 70s through early 90s. And then, so we get into interesting questions of Carusha and all these things. But for the most part, there were Carusha going back to Hank Molt, Stolen World talks about them. I think some of that stuff is more like Fiji. And the Australis are from the Reef Islands, as I understand, which are a little bit a ways away. They're tucked down at the end of the Solomon Island chain, kind of floating out there. So they're not, the Paulsoni, I think, are pretty easy to find. And you talk about Isabel and stuff, and that's a place where civilization exists in a real way. So those were always more accessible. Australis, I think, are pretty inaccessible. And then the Solomon Islands were closed after maybe even including sort of the Hank Molt time. And then in the early 90s, they had opened up and sent out a lot of snakes, Australis paulsoni. And some of those, at least in the context of paulsoni, were reproduced. And so those were kind of always around, but even in low, if you went back to 2014, there were paulsoni, there weren't a ton of paulsoni, but they were around, they did exist, they had been produced throughout that time. Australis, really, that wasn't the case. I think for the most part, Candoia, the gestation period tends to be pretty long. In my experience, it was about, about 7 months. And I think on most of those things, you kind of think 7-8 months, something like that. And so people would get them and they wouldn't even maybe look big. And then 7 months later, they'd drop babies. Oh, I bred them. And it's, well, maybe it did, but probably it didn't, and maybe they bred in the box on the way over, but, those sorts of things. So I don't know. The point of that would be that there were not any, I had never seen Solomon Island tree boas available that I was aware of until 2014.
Do you remember, I think his name was Jerry Conway. He used to do Candoia.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, that he passed away recently.
Really?
Yeah, that's my understanding.
Everything, because I got a paulsoni probably 2014, whatever the year is when things started coming in, and so I looked back at all his stuff, and all his stuff I think was like early mid 2000s maybe.
Right, and so there obviously they had come in, and there must have been some. Again, I can't speak to the legality, and they're similar to so these are Candoia bibrinae australis. They're bibrinae from Fiji and Vanuatu and sort of these other islands that are a different, it's a different country, possibly different countries, where that subspecies exists. And those snakes have a slightly different pattern and are generally speaking larger. So whether we really historically have had good insight into, I can easily imagine, particularly in a semi-legal context, going back to Hank's stuff, I'm not sure whether he was bringing in bibrinae or bibrinae australis. So it's a bit mixed, and honestly, even based on the information we have now, I don't know that we have great insight from where we sit to really say, oh, that's one or the other. There are certainly characteristics, and I think I could tell you, but I wouldn't. That's definitely a known unknown. There are things that I don't know for sure on that. But anyway, so Jerry did have some of those. I don't know whether he ever produced Australis, and if he did, whether they were Australis that had been bred in the wild and then were born at his place. I know Tom Crutchfield had some born at his place. I don't know whether he produced them. The really cool bit about these snakes is that they have a crazy ability to change color. So that those two that are right next to each other, that one and the one you highlighted previously, those are the same snake.
Wait a second. This black one and this animal?
Yeah.
No.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are the same snake. And that was the first one that I got that had come in 2014, and I got from Ryan Burke.
So that one audio, like this one animal is a light greenish hue with some pink, and then the animal that is the same animal is black with some like orangish creamy random spots on it. Like totally different animal.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, they have a remarkable ability to change color, sort of, I guess, most akin to maybe a gargoyle or a crested gecko that you were talking about earlier, in terms of how dramatically they can change. And so that's one of the things, an impetus to get things in cages to see them change color and really be able to look at them and say, is this the same? Is this different? Because they're another one that to an even more extreme degree, the follicles must get massive before they're ovulated, so that people perpetually, and especially on something that then has a 7 to 8 month gestation, they can hold those follicles really big for maybe 4 or 5 or 6 months, so that you're sitting there thinking, oh, I've got a gravid one, I'm only months away. and the thing never even ovulated. It's just sitting on really big follicles, and you'll ultimately get nothing. That female that you pulled up has done that to me.
And how'd you go about, I mean, did you buy these, how'd you start the project? Did you buy them as babies?
So I got a pair that were adults. So that the female that you had pulled up previously, I got a pair from Ryan, and then 2 years later, another shipment had come in from Solomon. Another shipment or two came in from the Solomon Islands, and I got maybe 6 more or something like that, and I had wound up having mostly females. So then another shipment came in 2018, and I sent some females to Jeff Murray, and he traded, 1 for 1. We swapped. I sent him some females, and he sent me some extra males, so that I had enough males. And then I've subsequently gotten a couple more, so that I actually have more males than females. Though that being said, I know Jerry's thing with Candoia, and I another soapbox that we could talk about. But I agree with him that it's a good idea to have multiple males. I think that probably doesn't hurt. But that being said, the babies that I got last year, I just used 1 male. That wasn't it wasn't necessary there. But the male that produced, well, the pair of them that produced were both the largest ones that I've had, and even possibly the largest ones that I've seen. So the male was actually one that Jeff had sent me, and is the largest male that I've seen. And the female had come into Cameron's place and was the largest one of the probably 150 or so total that I've seen him bring in, the largest one that's come in. So looking at it, it's one of these things where you can just sort of look at it and say, wow, this is a really impressive old snake. I think this snake's probably 25 or 30 years old when it came in, and that was going on 5 years ago.
Wow. And I've only seen these as babies, and they're small. So what's a big individual? A big adult?
They're not that big, which again, maybe is sort of when you see people saying, oh, well, they're 6 foot long. I think that's probably confusion with biberni. I mean, maybe that female is getting towards 4.5 or 5 feet, and maybe when not gravid, 2.5 or 3 inches across, in diameter at the mid body. That one of the pictures that you had just scrolled through was did show her when she was gravid. And they did, I guess the one point I would make in terms of people saying, oh, is my snake gravid, is if they are gravid, once you're a few months into it, they take on the typical gravid boa features. So they don't just look like a stuffed sausage. They start showing pyramiding off the spine and lateral distension and scale separation and stuff like that. It is funny to me that I did post pictures of that snake sort of throughout the process. And I think maybe because of how people react to things on Facebook, that people don't want to be the person who, yeah, so not that one. I think maybe scroll down instead. Yeah, so that one to the left, that, yeah, they're hovering over. So that's her very gravid. That's probably 2/3 of the way through. And you can see how she's laterally distended, and that the prominence of the spine, and just the difference in her body weight between her first third and sort of her middle third.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, so humorously, I posted those pictures, and people there was no, oh, is she gravid or anything like that. And I think maybe people get worried that people are going to view them negatively or say, no, of course not. People are just too mean to each other on the internet. But
yeah. At least I'm sure a Candoia group is probably pretty
I think it's relatively tame.
Yeah. There's no 12-year-olds in there.
And I mean, if they are, they're, that's the thing.
They're a cool ass 12-year-old.
Yeah, right. As someone who's been into reptiles from that age, I've certainly, made an ass of myself in the way that any 12-year-old is bound to do when they're talking to people that are 10 to 50 years older or whatever, 60 years old or whatever it might be.
Robyn's mom.
Yeah, right. Robyn's mom. But no, I mean, it's all good. And I think you just have to try and have a good attitude and do the best that you can. It's getting a little bit dark here. The sun's going down. Let me manipulate the lights and go get a drink and stuff.
Yeah, go for it. Okay, yeah, I can cover some time.
Right on.
Yeah, so guys, it is the, I guess, heat of the egg laying season. And I had 3 clutches laid in one day. And then I had 1 2 days later. And now it's been like 2 or 3 days without eggs. And it's weird, but when we get around this time, 2 to 3 days without eggs is like painstaking. Because there's a bunch of female that I know are on the cusp. And I'm also being like, do I suck at this? Am I going to get clutches from this female, from that female, blah, blah, blah. So, but yeah, I have Eastern Black King Snakes that I'm incubating right now. I have Ghost Clutch. There's a Ghost to a Coral Ghost Tessera. I have, I wish I could remember who laid. A-Male Buff Stuff. Yes. And other than that, I got a bunch of other stuff going on. But Louisiana Pine just went in her pre-lay shed. So that will be fun. I mean, it's crazy because I work with a bunch of colubrids, and you can see that these females are just filled with eggs. And then you go to the Louisiana Pine, and like she is not really that distended. You can't tell that much. And if anything, I can tell that she has like 2 to 3 eggs, which is kind of a weird thing. I wish she would have more, but that's probably what we're looking at. I would be surprised if we got to 5, to be honest. Probably looking at 3 to 4 eggs again. Last year I got 3, 2 fertile. So if I can get 3 fertile eggs, I mean, I would be happy with that. But anyway, Rob is back. So yeah, man, Candoya. I mean, how'd you go about, pairing them? Was there any information that you were going off on even what time to pair them or what time of the season to pair them?
So the only person that I know the only information that I had in terms of actual precise information, and I can easily imagine, certainly I don't say that people hadn't produced them. It's just that a lot of the information that folks would give out was so vague. And I think that's just a function of the distance from when it happened. Tom Crutchfield talking about having litters in the 80s. He's not going to really remember the details and specifics of that. And the other part of it, right, is if they have a 7-month gestation, by the time, if you are managing a collection that size or an operation that size in terms of stuff going in and out and all this stuff, it's probably pretty unlikely that you're going to really have detailed notes in terms of all the stuff that was going on.
Or so you probably gave up on it already.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's like, kind of like, yeah, okay. Especially on something I do think, obviously in the wild, in terms of their body form and probably how many of them there are in really condensed space, that they probably only breed every 2, 3, maybe more a year, something like that. So that, like, on the one that produced for me, that at a guess came in at 25 to 30 years old, we're probably talking maybe she's bred, I don't know, 2 or 3 times before, something like that. There is one interesting bit, since we're sort of it's sort of topical to this point, would be that generally speaking, people keeping them are probably going to have more of an issue with males than they will with females. I think in the wild that males, absent maybe being really, really big males, are probably only eating lizards their entire life. So what you can see is they do seasonally fast in terms of a reproductive season. Getting them to take first meals again, sometimes it can be an issue, and utilizing either frozen thawed lizard or lizard scent at that point can be super helpful. Did I explain the floating pinks thing? I don't know. We might have to put a pin in that. You might have to take a note and come back to it. But
oh shit! Did we end up forgetting that?
I think so. But
maybe we
can come back.
Bring it back
try
around.
And remember. Yeah, we'll try and remember to come back to that. But anyway, so that's a side note. I know you were talking to Laura. Is that her name? The gal you had on a couple weeks ago.
Yep.
Okay. And she had gotten some, and I just know the advice I give to people would be to say, on immature females and on males, just know that you might, when they seasonally go off food, that's normal. But then in terms of restarting them, you might have to utilize some lizard scent, something like that, especially with those males, because I think once they don't eat for a while, they kind of stop remembering that, oh, I could eat these things too. And get them to take rodents.
Do
At
they have
least that's been
preference
my
on
experience.
lizards? I mean, do they
Well,
care? Does gecko, skink, a knoll?
the easiest thing for me to get, right, is the invasive brown anoles out of Florida. Um, Ian Bissell had put me on to Eric Chung, who collects them to order, and that would be the route to go, or at least what I would recommend. But sort of in the same way as talking about, we justify the things that we want to do anyway. If you don't live there, then you're FedEx shipping a bunch of lizards that, that's not nothing. And so to view it as, well, I could feed this, I can buy pinks from Rodent Pro for 20 cents or something ridiculous, 20 or 30 cents or whatever. If you get live brown anoles shipped to you not close to there, that meal costs 10 times that. And you have to manage them and keep them going. And you're taking care of a bunch of lizards. So I don't know. I think it's one of those things where is it that you don't want to feed them a lizard, or there's parasite transfer from lizards, or is it you don't want to be giving them something that costs you $4, for every week, so that's, I think some of that gets lost.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we're talking about these guys and getting going, I mean, having wild caught animals, I mean, they shouldn't even really be on the same time schedule. I mean, seasonality, how does that even work?
Right.
Did you just acclimatize them right away into our winter? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I just sort of the room. Well, so I am a proponent of, I think there are cycles. Eric and I were talking about this, and I know he was talking about this with Scott, and I think Keith as well on the most recent show. Not that I've heard it, but from talking to him, that was something that they talked about is, I think there's a bunch of variables that we can perceive when you're talking about light cycles, temperature cycles, humidity cycles across the year, or even one thing that I think we forget sometimes is that some of these cycles aren't even annual, but they might be every 2 or 3 years, right? Certainly if you're talking about something like El Nino or La Nina, that some of these cycles and some of these species, we sort of conceive of them as being, oh, well, even if these particular snakes didn't breed, only breed every 2 or 3 years, you might have populations of snakes that only, as a population, just don't produce at all in a given year. So then if you're looking at something, sort of, we have this expectation that these things produce every year. Oh, my snakes aren't breeding. I'm pairing my pair of Moluccan pythons or Homo Hera pythons. Certainly I've been there, where, and they didn't go. And it's like, well, that given snake may only have produced every 2 or 3 or 5 years or something. And that's in a year where the conditions were right for them to do so. So you might have a year, theoretically, depending on the range of species and the variability of situation. Eric and I were talking about it in the context of Owen Pelly pythons, where I wouldn't be shocked if there are years where there are no Owen Pelly pythons born based on the seasonal conditions that occur. And then even when conditions are appropriate, maybe you have stuff only every second or third year in a given or longer time frame in a given snake. So I just think sometimes we lose the context of that. So I try and hit or just allow within my conditions to happen all of the seasonality that does occur in terms of barometric pressure, humidity, temperature, light cycling, humidity cycling more generally, just in terms of, if the heat's on, the humidity, which is never high in here in the first place, goes down. And there are other times where I'm trying to, kind of spring and fall, trying to hit that as much as I can to accentuate what happens. And to some extent, it's not even a function of mimicking nature, but rather trying to give a more extreme version of the nature that occurs, right? In terms of light cycling, take home Hera Pythons, right? It's basically 12:12 there all year round. Maybe it gets down to 11:30, one way, 12:30 the other, but they still perceive that, I think. And so if you switch them then to going 8, have a range of daylight from 8:16 down to 13:11, you're really hammering that button so that they're perceiving that as, wow, this is the most extreme year I've ever seen, or hitting that impulse, right, on a captive produced animal in the most extreme way they've ever seen. And you're really accentuating something that they perceive. And it's not, oh, well, I'm mimicking exactly what they're seeing, but rather I'm really trying to hammer the response to that. So I try and do all those things. And then as someone who watches nature shows and all this stuff and just sort of tries to perceive the world as being, I think intrinsically we as humans don't, the reality of things is too vast for most of us to really understand, myself included. There are definitely things that are happening that I don't have the ability to conceptualize, let alone turn into something that I'm actively doing or not doing in my room, right? So that, like, and I think it behooves us to view the world that way, in terms of saying there are so many complexities and implications and subtleties that we're doing the best we can, and you just have to kind of view it that way. So that we always talk about, the 6 variables you can control, and then there's a handful of others that are happening that maybe I'm not even aware of, and certainly food cycling, and then even maybe I'm injecting carotenoids and other things, putting lorikeet chow into, injecting that into rodents and all that. I know Eric did that with the homes.
I was about to say, have you done that?
Oh yeah. I mean, someone was just talking about on one of these podcasts was talking about, and maybe it was Scott. I don't remember, but anyway, so Rapashi, right, I think, it was Ian talking to, no, it was the Chondrocast. Ian was on there, but David Brahms, I think, was talking about dusting the butts of rodents with stuff. But I think he was talking about just doing like crested gecko diet and that sort of thing. So I haven't done it with crested gecko diet, but I've done it with the super pig stuff. And I did see, boosting those carotenoids does make a difference in the visual output of stuff, doing that with their eye. I have an interest in the Reptile Inc. stuff. It's not a new concept. T-Rex used to do that back in the mid-90s. If you pull up a Reptiles magazine, there's the links and all that stuff. Yeah.
And I know back in the day, the corn snake breeders used to do calcium. They used to dust, especially for their breeders, for egg laying and creation per se.
The interesting bit of that is I've actually heard of it being too much. So Orthriophis, the beauty snakes and related species, have a really thick, weird shelled egg anyway. And Toby Brock down in Corpus Christi was doing that, one year gave him calcium supplements, and he wound up making these eggs the snakes couldn't hatch out of.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so be a little judicious with some of that stuff, but and I'm sure he would. I think that's Rat Snake Foundation Forum stuff. I don't think I'm talking out of school, and I don't actually know. I haven't been in touch with him in a while. I don't know if he keeps stuff at this point, but just in terms of they do have a very strange sort of segmented egg anyway, and then he wound up having issues associated with overcalcification of eggs when he had supplemented the females. So on something like a corn snake where they have we're talking about different snakes, right? In the sense the beauty snake tends to have large eggs and have relatively few large eggs in a single clutch in a year. A corn snake that has a ton of small eggs, possibly, I mean, it's not a public milk snake, right, where you're getting 6 clutches in a year. Theoretically, an African house snake, it's always funny to me that people talk about producing the heck out of African house snakes. I never have had good success breeding them. I think part of it is having albino. Well, so the thing with African house snakes is there are so many sort of hidden species that I think one issue we run into is making sure that you actually have a pair of the same thing. So in terms, I do think what it comes back to is like people, our experience is limited to our own experience, right? Our own experience of the world. And if you bought a pair of snakes that were, say, captive hatch babies from a given pair, then, well, those will either be the same thing or they're close enough to have made it work, right? In terms of actually producing something. And then your experience is limited to breeding those things. And there you have, you don't have a lurker species context, right? Where actually you're unwittingly trying to make hybrids that look the same. And so you're having fertility problems. So I think I've seen some of that. So if you're going to do house snakes, I would recommend you get them from the same shipment. And the albino thing, albino to albino doesn't work well.
Really?
Yeah, and I don't know if that's a product, something associated with the gene, more like an albino spotted python, or if that's, something where
Inbreeding depression of some sort.
Yeah, if it's inbreeding depression. But I certainly know the rep on those was always you wanted to breed a homozygous to a heterozygous animal when you were producing them to get the best viability. And those are theoretically capensis that are, the same thing. So if you're doing the albino stuff, maybe it makes sense. But just a side note everyone says that African house snakes are the easiest snakes to breed. And
I hear that all the time, and they consistently produce.
Yeah, I would say, but and make there are a couple things to make sure that you have right, or it's not going to work.
Yeah. So who doesn't have eggs? Candoya. How the hell did we get there?
Right. So, yeah, I don't know. You didn't know you were going to talk about African house snakes, huh? I bet that wasn't on the playlist today.
But then again, that's just another thing that Rob Stone has capped at one point in his life.
Yeah, sure. I like them a lot. Man, Aurora house snakes are some of the coolest snakes there are.
Those are crazy.
Yeah.
And then I don't know if you've seen these green ones. There's green ones that have been coming out recently. I don't forget what the species is called.
Oh yeah. Okay.
I'll check them out. I'll find one for you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no, and I remember even going back to old TFH books in the same way, man, where you just see the species that was, say, South Africa really tends to be closed, at least since I've been keeping reptiles to export. So there are a ton of South African species that are really cool. There's this German reptile magazine, a small sort of half size magazine called Soria from the mid 90s. And this was one from, I think from Uganda, right? There was some house snake on the cover, and it's sort of this purple and blue and gold tri-stripe snake that I just was asking Matt Most if he'd ever seen him come through Outback or anything like that, because I've never seen him here, but that would be a cool snake to keep too. It certainly is a house snake. So,
if those get, like the auroras and stuff, are those not around? They're a little bit more difficult, or are they just less imported?
Both, yeah. Both things are true. I remember, so Denver Zoo had bred the auroras, and the babies were a pain in the butt, that wanted lizards and were just small. I guess that it prompts something I was thinking earlier when we were talking about, I was saying Alterna and Theri are things that take really well to being assist-fed mouse tails. There are other things like an eastern hognose snake that are, the form of their body is not such to really accommodate that, right? It's 4 times the width of a mouse tail, so that's not going to work. So you need to, that you're going to have to try and get them to take a toad scented pinky, because you can't assist them a mouse tail. And those things, based on that width, just have the ability to toss it right back up, anything you put down there. Greenhouse snakes. What's the species?
I don't know. See, this is saying a hypo, like it's some type of
that looks like more like a,
but there's one that is legit, and I'm trying to look at Kayla, because Kayla Bell got some. She imported them from like Europe or somewhere. I can actually see him in the banner of her thing, but it's going to be hard to get. But I'm not sure. I want to say that they're a separate species. Maybe the is it the olive house snake? That's the common name, or is that
Okay.
basically the
Yeah, I mean, certainly that is a snake that exists. Whether that is that snake, I wouldn't have thought so, but that looks more like as you say, like maybe a mutation, like a fulginosis or a capensis
right?
mutation than it is a, um, just in terms of scalation and the eye stripe thing.
Yes, this
Um,
stripe. This is Kayla's animal. Um,
yeah, that's
yeah, they
neat.
have that eye stripe.
That's
Still
very
not as
cool.
good as the Aurora house snake, though, right?
Yeah, man, they're just neat little snakes, you know. And something you really don't see at this point. There are definitely people that are producing them, 100%. But it's just one of those. It's the classic situation, right, where we say, "Oh, they're no one's working with them." Well, not no one. It's just that we're not exposed to it on the level to. It counts as no one unless that person happens to be a buddy of yours or whatever, so that you're aware of what he's doing. So much is
Right.
happening that we're in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like that would, I don't know, that would be a snake that you would keep. A smaller colubrid, skinny, and
Yeah,
seems like it
I
would be
mean,
your thing with the Hera and Alterna.
yeah, certainly. I mean, well, and then, I know in the pictures I sent you, there are Petias in there and stuff too, and indigo. I like indigos. Who doesn't like a really smart snake? Petias is basically an indigo, but far more nervous. I know Billy Hunt I sent him that female, and he had to go and make a whole crazy lockbox and all this. I told him, man, just keep it on some cork bark. But I didn't lie. I said, yeah, it's super shy and nervous and all this stuff, and is right. They're like a super shy indigo, whereas an indigo is just gonna, you know, it has the same level of attention but isn't afraid.
Yeah, sometimes intelligence is kind of a negative thing. They're smart enough to
Oh,
know who
100%.
to hate.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, if it's a retake as a risk, a potential risk to your safety, or whatever. But in
rock
terms
monitor
of
is also something I know you've kept before.
yeah, man. Well, only briefly, and the mistake of that was saying like, okay, well, who the heck can I realistically sell this thing to? So Cameron had gotten in these baby, within 6 week old baby croc monitors, and the thing was fascinating and gorgeous, and it wasn't that much, they're more now than they were at the time, and it was like, man, this thing is so cool. Sure, I'll do it, and the thing would look at you and it gave you the, you know, Jurassic Park, you could see something's working in the background. The humorous, semi-humorous bit of that was when I was at volunteering at Denver Zoo. One day, the male croc monitor was dead in the pool in the exhibit, and so he had gone in and grabbed it and then brought it to the to do a necropsy up in the vet's office at the zoo. And the thing is splayed out on the table, and the initial process or whatever is going to be to open its stomach by starting, the sawing through the pelvis, right? And I'm standing there, and it did give just the impressiveness of this animal is such that I'm standing there thinking I'm about to be in, some scene from Alien Autopsy where the second the saw hits the animal, the thing pops up from the table, and we're all, we've all bit it. So that was the profound experience of the whole thing. Saying terror that the second the saw hit the thing, it was just going to go berserk.
You end up seeing anything cool?
No, so I think ultimately it was sort of a classic, monitor thing, classic goanna thing, where it was just stress that, his intestines were essentially tied into multiple knots. And it presumably is a stress reaction to being in there with the female, but he was beat up, a little bit or whatever, but nothing that would suggest, he looked fine ostensibly, but his guts, were a mess. And it's like, okay, well, this is clearly a stress response to being exposed to her. And I've seen that in other things. I've seen it in Kimberly Rocks and stuff. My other favorite monitors, the best, working at Pro Exotic, going back to the Pro Exotics thing in terms of Prasina, Bakari are cool. I kind of have a soft spot for them, but generally speaking, the Australians are super into stuff that they can't have in the same way that we're into stuff that we can't have or whatever. So Prasina are the thing. And I'm like, oh, Glowerdi are way cooler monitors, man. Super, so much cooler. Although,
So I'm not a
again,
monitor
it gets
guy.
into
Is Persina green trees?
uh-huh.
What are
Yeah.
and then what's the other one that you said?
So Bakeri are the black tree monitors. They're from
Okay.
Aru. They're structurally very similar. That whole complex of things are clearly very closely related, at least in body form, and they're just isolated into different colors and things based on, whether they're Risingera or the Macraei, and the blue trees, the yellow trees, the blue trees. Then you get Cordensis that are more or less green trees, but with a different patterning and things from a different spot from Biak. But I know they're, sort of the cool thing, and I'm like, I don't know, they're in the same way as the dragon rat snake. I don't know, it's just not my thing. I don't like snakes that look emaciated. I don't like tree monitors that just sort of have that look. It's just not my thing. Whereas a Glowerdi that has the same body weight just looks fit, as opposed to looking like it's starved.
And those animals are typically pretty reclusive and skittish, right? As far as
Right.
tree monitors go.
Yeah, certainly. Most of the tree monitor stuff tends to be, and then certainly, my Pro Exotics bred them unsuccessful. Well, got eggs and things. It was a whole working progress from when I was there the first time to actually producing them and stuff. But so they are cool. They are generally speaking more reclusive. To me, Kimberleys that are so gregarious. I mean, I have that picture of the one that's sitting like it's sitting on a recliner. That particular female that I had for years and years and years, down to a time when, everyone talks about the import of Australian reptiles as though it's a continual thing that's unavailable. It's more accurate to say that there are ebbs and flows to it. Certainly they aren't being exported from Australia, but in terms of imports from Europe, there were no Bell's lace monitors. I remember talking to Hank Molt about Bell's lace monitors and Owen Pelly Pythons and Mitchell's monitors at Daytona in 2003 and 2004, and it was a pipe dream, even though in Europe there were Bell's Laces and stuff like that. And then within 5 years, there were some legally imported to the US because there was a stretch around 2009, 2010, where, Australian shipments of Australian reptiles with paperwork from Europe were being cleared. Now we're back into a stretch that's more like 2003, 2004, 2005, where they weren't. So that in 2007, 2008, there were essentially no Glowerdi in the US. Brandon up at Canadian Coldblood had some. There were certainly a few, but it seemed the sort of odds-on number seemed like maybe there were fewer than 10 females in the US, in 2007, 2008. So it's good to see that they're now, have bounced back, and we got some, and now there are more people seemingly doing really well with them. I know Brandon Shiflett's doing well. Justin Barocas was kind of the one guy who, maintained throughout the whole thing. But there's a perfect example to the point, you were raising about some things are more fun to keep than others based on how they react, is that Pilbarensis, which are beautiful, right? With oranges, and some of them you can get blue and white. I have one that American flag looking little lizard, right? But they're always super shy and they'll bite. Like the one great shot I have of that lizard is it's busy biting my middle finger. You can see, oh wow, that was this gorgeous lizard, and it's like, why? How'd you get it to hold still? Well, it's biting the crap out of my finger. So I don't know. To me, Mertens and then Glowerdi are the bee's knees for sure.
The bee's knees, the cat's pajamas. You heard it. So we got to loop back around because we went off right there. Candoya. So gravid Candoya. How many babies did she lay when she laid?
So she had 13 live babies, and there were 4 that looked like they would have been fine, but maybe got smashed either by the furniture and things. they weren't slugs. They looked like they were born live, but maybe she had squashed them inadvertently or something like that, or trapped under the furniture. The other part of it is when you're talking about a 7-month incubate or gestation and not having any cognizance of that. I did sort of, admittedly, she started again going back to cages. Cages, and I suppose there's one other bit that I do think is interesting or something to consider for people if you have a dedicated reptile room, is utilizing red lights as the fixtures in the room. Or if you're a fancy pants who has multiple lighting systems within the room, you could have your day bulbs and then your red bulbs that you would utilize at night, so that you're actually getting sort of nocturnal behavior, and you can actually maintain a photo period, an annual photo period, that you can't if you just Bob Applegate it and turn on the lights for 2 days because you're off from the firehouse or whatever. Clearly it works, and it can work, but just in terms of my own approach and enjoyment in terms of seeing natural behavior out of them, like you can tell by the aperture of the pupils that, like, man, these things, I can't tell whether they're perceiving some of this light or not, but certainly they're not perceiving it in the same way that they perceive the bulb in this room, right? Where, like, all of a sudden it's supposed to be the middle of the night and all of a sudden the sun is back out, which would have to be weird to their circadian rhythms and things. Again, I guess it doesn't matter for a lot of North American colubrids and stuff because it's proven not to matter. But I don't think it hurts, and it certainly makes them much more enjoyable. In the sense of Australis, here we'll stay on topic for a second, at least with this, that Australis are perceived to be totally tame, and that's generally speaking true. But what I would say is they're totally tame when the lights are on. When we can see normally, then yeah, they're totally tame. Under a red bulb, all of them, especially certainly. So I feed seasonally as well, but within the feeding season, sure, I'd give you $20, man, if you're gonna put your hand in there, because it won't have been worth it. Like, oh, okay, cool, they're tame. Okay, feel free, man. Here's $20. So open it up and pull her out. Let's see how it goes. The females in particular, because they're so much more responsive to rodents, which is more of a reflection of body heat than the males that are eating lizards that don't really put off body heat in the same way, or even retain to reflect in the same way. Man, they're not tame. The point being, they're not tame at night. When they're in a feeding mode, they are not tame, and it hurts a lot. They have a lot of jaw pressure, and those teeth are really strongly recurved. So it's a good thing that they're so calm when we mostly expose ourselves to them, because it's very unpleasant.
Yeah. I mean, those Candoya all have a very particularly shaped head. I guess that comes in handy.
Oh yeah, like they grab and hold on, and it's not the worst, but it's not great, man. It's probably like being bit by a roughie, which is probably pretty terrible. So,
but I don't know many people who have. I don't know if I know anyone who has.
Somehow, I don't think Owens pulled it off, at least not with size, which is disappointing.
Disappointing that he didn't get bit, or?
Oh yeah, I mean,
yeah, he's been bit by everything else in his collection. So.
Yeah, right. I mean, we should make something out of that. I know the Carpet Fest is maybe made online or canceled or whatever, but I still plan on coming out we can go in a small group and go do.
Let's see if Owen can get bit by a roughie type of. Fest.
Maybe I'm thinking that one of the events we can have a fundraiser or something, associated with. Let's see him get lit up by one of them.
Yeah, change his tune. He'll get out of roughies, and that'll be it.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose we could, we could go out of our way to help him, and I guess take him on board and stuff. Maybe, okay, I guess we can take care of him for him.
I mean, that would be, we would be being good friends, I think.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, at this point, we got to take the whole clutch and the eggs and everything too. It's a whole thing,
right?
But babies were the babies kind of aggressive at all coming out to anything?
No. So that's the other thing too. In terms of feeding them, they're not. Generally speaking, they didn't respond to movement, either movement or scent. So it was pretty clear to me. And so I should say, so that in terms of producing them, the one very detailed records that I had access to was a guy in the UK had bred them sort of semi inadvertently. I think he had them paired with a pair of them together in the same cage as a pair of Paulsoni, and in a big cage, and he wound up producing them in 2008 or 2009, and actually it's still visible on the king snake Candolia forum. So speaking of that, so there is some information there, and I certainly read and reread and saw the baby, all sorts of. It's certainly detailed and gave me some sense of, well, at least it's possible, because here's an example of it happening, and not even sort of in a, well, I've tried four pairs for 4 years and eventually got one to go, but rather kind of, oh, I had a pair and they bred. So that gave some optimism. And then Mark Goyer, who's Nick Mutton's buddy, so he's up in the Pacific Northwest, produced them 2 years in a row, I think, certainly at least 2 years in a row. But he wound up losing all the babies because he had a heck of a time getting them to eat, not having access to lizards. So I think he lost all of them. 2018, Dan Maliri brought in some Australis and brought in at least one female that was very heavily gravid, such that she dropped her babies. I think the first one dropped like the next day. He put it on YouTube. So there's a Dan Maliri YouTube video where I got these yesterday, and now there's, a litter of babies or whatever. So Jeff Murray and I bought those babies, and then I got, I think 3/4 of them, something like. I bought 3/4 of them, and he kept a couple. Both, so we could both just have some experience working with the small ones. And so I tried a whole host of different things, including assisting tails and trying assisting lizards and tease feeding, all this stuff. Ultimately, I had one of 6 that wound up doing well, and I still have now. And that's there's amongst those pictures, there's one that looks particularly amazing, and you can tell it's pretty small. It's sitting on the side of a tub in there. That is that animal at about a year old. So I learned lessons associated with that. I don't know whether issues that I saw were associated with maybe parasite or infection problems in that female, which you can see particularly in live birthing species sometimes. But the other thing I've seen, certainly having the litter that I had this year, and so Jeff had at least one of the ones that he had gotten survive as well, and so he sent that one to me. So I have the one that I raised out, or the one that survived on my end. Yeah, that's the one. The one that survived on his end. And then I have some of the ones from this clip. So there's the female about 2 weeks before she's going to give birth in that picture there. And you can see how she looks kind of really lumpy and bad. Those are good signs relative to breeding boas. And that weird sort of vitiligo thing cropped up about 2 or 3 weeks before she dropped those babies, and was bizarre. And she went back to normal. She did not shed before dropping the babies. They came out, and then she didn't feed until she shed, and she shed about 2 weeks after she had had them.
So it's like another weird hormonal color change, though.
Yeah, totally. She went in total something like 10.5 or 11 months without eating, while developing 17 viable offspring in her body.
So is that pretty average? Because I think I remember hearing like Paulsoni can have 40 or so. They have.
I don't know. I think the guy in the UK had less, maybe more like 8. I think these. So Australis, from all that I am aware of, are kind of in the middle, right? They're sort of middle to low. The Candoia carinata tend to have, a small number, maybe 3 to 5, 2 to 5, somewhere in that range. I think the Australis are probably somewhere in that 8 to 18 sort of range. So 17, even though that 4 of them were not alive, was when I saw them, which was the next morning. I did get some clues as to this, but the point would be that 7 months in, and you're kind of, it's natural to start questioning yourself, and whatever you're now knowing kind of when they might come, I'll be more, I guess, slightly more inclined to mist and things, which would help those little babies. But the downside of that, when you're talking about boas, is that you don't want to sometimes stress of misting them or changing the circumstances in a way like that can actually induce them to induce parturition such that they do it outside of the time frame they normally would. So as much as I would say, oh, now I'll start spraying on day 206, I don't know that I would, because if those were supposed to go to 215 in this case, I might actually induce them and wreck the whole thing. So you just sort of have to watch and try and manage it the best you can and hope for the best. To me, beyond even the feeding, because for the most part, everyone in that litter ultimately took a live brown animal. Some of them, it took 6 weeks to get to that point. Others started right away. The difficulty with them is they have very thick skin, and they're not kind of regular, consistent shedders. So it's important to maintain them more so even than the adults on a humid, like keeping them on sphagnum moss in a rack that gives them plenty of access to heat, to make sure that they can shed right. I know some of the ones that we had gotten from Dan, because they hadn't had a first shed, and based on the time frame I saw in mine, they must not have had the first shed, which happens basically instantly, because they were having it in the box when I got shipped them. So they were opaque, or maybe it stuck just slightly, something that wouldn't be a big deal at all to a colubrid, caused real problems to these snakes. But that second shed wasn't, at least in this litter that I saw, it didn't happen for like a month or 6 weeks. So it must have been the first shed, because there's no way it was the second. So if someone produces babies, be cautious with that, because it'll stick, and then if it sticks, they're pretty much done for, even if you can get it off. It seems to really constrict their eyes, cause breathing problems. And in the ones I had from Dan, I had a few where the eyes basically popped out of their heads, which was problematic and disconcerting.
Just minorly.
So that was a weird bit. I didn't see any of that in my babies. So that's again where we say, well, maybe there was some sort of parasitic transfer from the female into those babies. And I'm not sure whether all the ones that Jeff and I got were from a single litter, or if they were from a mixture of two. Because I think Dan did have two different litters. So I'm not 100% on that, and maybe that was an issue that we were seeing there. But yeah, that was weird and disconcerting and grody. So yeah, and obviously that was a precursor to them not surviving. But I would say that there's some level of possibility that that's just from literally having been opaque and failing to shed on the day that they would naturally have done so, because they were being shipped. And that was literally enough to do it. So that they are sensitive in that way. They're very sensitive.
So are these animals that you waited for that first shed to offer food?
So they shed immediately, more or less immediately on birth. And that's where you get into the question of, well, if the greater access to humidity, maybe that was something that caused problems in those 4 that were seemingly fine. Again, I just don't have the information to speak to that. But they shed on birth, and then, I fed them, offered them food right away. And the earliest ones took small live brown anoles within the first week or so. And then others, I think the longest holdouts for maybe 2 months or so. But it is worth pointing out, or I do highlight that ultimately all of them took live brown anoles, and that was all that I did. I didn't try anything else. What you can do with those is it does tend to help if you put more than one lizard in at the same time, because the lizards kind of provoke activity in one another, which can help. Whereas if you have a single lizard, it can just sort of be hanging out and not really doing anything, and that's not really attracting the attention of the snake. Yeah, so other than that, I didn't do anything else because of my experience with the captive hatch stuff from Dan. Kind of steered me away from potentially assist feeding or anything like that. They're seemingly not that fragile, but again, it is just sort of like the one that did really well was one that had just taken live brown anoles, and I didn't mess with, and now it eats pinkies fine and stuff. It eventually had transitioned just with a standard sort of light scent, and no problem at all.
How long did it take altogether to get everyone on rodents?
Well, so they're not all on rodents. Yeah, from August or whatever, I still have a handful that eat lizards.
Is that something that you're willing to stick out? For shit.
Yeah, I mean,
fortunately,
right? I think at some point I will try and get them to eat something else, but it would be a little bit different if they were the only things I had. So I was having to do the whole lizard thing solely because of them, but that's not the case. So, presumably when you get to the point where there's only this one or two things, your motivation changes than when you have a half dozen things across a variety of stuff that want lizards, and even speaking to the adult males, the import males and stuff, I have a couple now that I had these large anoles that had been too big for anything for me to feed to anything, and so they had been around for 6 or 7 months or whatever. And then I had male Australis that had been on fast associated with breeding, and then hadn't been taking back to mice. And I tell you what, man, they ate those.
Nice.
So, but then I was fully out, and I called Eric and or messaged Eric and said, yeah, I could use something like now, and you could even give me some big ones.
And now, what are your future plans with these animals?
I don't know. I mean, so I paired up so I had tried 4 females last year, and the one went, which was, again, speaking to the cage thing, very good, because I was able to look at their behavior and say, okay, I don't know necessarily what's working or not working, but I have 3 females that were paired up that are doing one thing, and that's very closely aligned to what they normally do in terms of hidden away during the day and then hunting at night. And I have one that's clearly on the opposite schedule and is doing something different to what it normally does, and what what the ones right next door to it are doing. And we had sort of hit on this a little bit earlier, but it's the point of the advantage of having more than just a single pair, and and this was a skipped over soapbox, but the advantage to more than one pair, right, is that you can then have a situation like I had there, and you can look and say, okay, even though this is ostensibly going to take 7 months to figure out whether what I'm thinking I'm seeing is what I'm seeing, I can still on a daily basis just look and say, well, I think something's going on, because it's not doing the same thing as the ones right next to it. What I was going to say in terms of previously alluded to soapbox is that I think we're in this kind of as a chondro thing, or we get it from the chondros more so than maybe corn snakes. So, although with the corn snake context, some of it's going to depend on the genetics that are involved. But I think it's sort of a captive fiction, this notion that, oh, well, I have this pedigree or, lineage or pedigree of snakes that, oh, this pair produced this baby, and they, its parents were this particular pair. Even if there's not really, in the genetic context, obviously there's some value to that. But if we were talking about perpetually doing the multiple males that were being introduced are all siblings so that it doesn't actually make a difference, that's much more akin to what happens in the wild. I mean, we're talking about Australis here, right, that are a communal species, that there's obviously there must be a crazy population density, or at least have been historically, so that thousands of them could come from this tiny area. They could literally go and just fill crates full of them. They must be in constant exposure to one another. There's almost no chance that a given female is only being bred by a single male. Almost none, right? Particularly in a species that doesn't appear to actively combat. Presumably that's just a reflection of the population of this species, that the diversity of genes is fine relative to the conditions in which they live. So I think generally speaking, it's our own fixation on saying, I want to be able to say that the pair that produced this particular snake was this male and this female, and that's a reflection of our own ideas more than it is a recreation of natural circumstance, where you see garter snakes or diamond pythons where there's a single female and there's 20 males that are riding around, and they're all trying to get their shot. And certainly we've seen with ball pythons, better than anything else, the fact that you can have multiple paternity, and that two of the babies might be from this male and two are from this male and two are from another male. If they were just wild phenotype, then you wouldn't be able to tell. But when they're incomplete dominant traits, and it's like, okay, well, this was obviously sired by 3 different males, because that's the only explanation for what we're seeing here. I think that's much, that would probably help our success. I think when we're talking about breeding rare species, that's probably, the fact we want to be able to say it was this pair of snakes probably means we don't have any snakes about which to say that.
That's a good point. And also, I think, for the green tree guys and stuff like that, it's a lot of marketing and calling them pretty names.
The thing is, man, I'm as down on having this cool chart as anybody, or thinking that that's cool. I do think that's cool. It doesn't drive the chondros that I've kept, because the exposure to Bushmaster, it's like, okay, well, either I tend to fancy locality snakes, so there would be that. But even then, like the stuff that Vladimir was doing in terms of the multi-generation locality cross, I had that stuff, man. I like that stuff a lot. Rubiac times Maroke, F2 or Rubiac stuff. Yeah, because you're getting the advantages of connecting genes that haven't been connected in the wild, that are legitimately, you're talking about different species, obviously, they are hybrids, and you're getting sort of these hybrid phenotypes that are fantastic. They're awesome snakes. Personally, I was always partial to white scales on chondros, because it's the one color that doesn't tend to change. If a scale turns white, it will stay white. So you could at least know you were okay, keep track of what's going on here. And okay, every white scale, that's +1 for the white scale count.
I was surprised when I was kind of looking into chondros, at least back in the day. I'm talking at least in the 90s or so, when they were importing them. I didn't realize that people were getting a ruse because they were so green and they tended to have more white scales, where today people are like, fuck that, I don't want a green snake with a little bit of white on it, and no one's into that anymore. But that was like a prized animal.
Oh, totally. And even when we had Cameron on MPR, it sort of was a reminder that the initial chondros that were coming sort of in the early 90s, at least, that he was getting, were Merauke's. And then there were no Merauke's, so that, a decade and a half later, I'm standing there going, oh man, I've never seen you have a Merauke. And that's all they, it used to be just these southern form snakes. And, the other cool thing about the white scale stuff is that the scales themselves tend to have a different shape. The ones that turn white tend to be shaped kind of differently. They're extra large and stuff like that. So you could get some predictiveness to it, more so than other colors. So I really like those too. They're cool. But, saying you can't do everything. And the point of that was just to be that I'm as impressed by anyone as when you say, oh, this snake has its ancestors go back to the first reproduction of the species, right? The Switek stuff or what, Steinhardt Aquarium, whatever, that I find that as impressive as anyone, but it's not necessarily the way to maximize what you're going to actually produce.
I think it's fun, especially when you get to a certain point and you have some animals in your collection that may be a little bit older, and you go back on lineage and you may see that, oh, like I didn't know that my friend actually had this same exact animal as I did, or this guy, a certain individual,
Yeah.
produced this animal. I think it's cool to know too. I mean, and it's cool to tell other keepers that, and that gets other people interested. And it has zero bearing on the actual animal. It has nothing to do with the actual animal.
And then even then, maybe it does. Maybe there's some look that, I guess the true point of this is mostly to the times where we just go back, especially with the Chondra stuff, where it's just silly names and there aren't pictures, And I'm just as, I can come up with a nickname, for a given, oh, okay, well that looks like a rind of Gouda cheese, but I'm not going to say Gouda, so I'm going to say Howda, or whatever. Like, okay, yeah, I had Howda and I sold that to, it's the male that Andre Mondine gets I sent him a black and white chondro, green with black and white and blue chondro or whatever. And he's made all this cool stuff and that's great, and that was a Highland outcross stuff out of the farm. So that was always more my speed with that. But I love the concept. But in terms of producing snakes, if you have 2 4-gene combo corn snakes that you're trying to make, or whatever, and it's like you run multiple males, you'll probably get better fertility. You
mean pairing multiple males to the one female?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm guessing it's nature's way of making sure there's genetic diversity. I mean, because colubrids, as far as the males go, they are always cruising. I mean, ask any herper out there in the spring, males are always cruising, and the fact that 2 males may find the same female is probably not far-fetched, like kind of what you were alluding to before.
Yeah, I mean, and again, so I understand not doing it, and certainly it would be a bad idea if you were, making palmettos or something, and you didn't have 2 males where that was suitable or where you could get the same result, right? But in instances that you do, it's probably, well, I guess in the same way, it's just what is more desirable, right? Is it more important to have something that you can identify the full lineage for, or is it to make those offspring?
There's too many recessive genes to do that in corn snakes. You got to breed what you know. Yeah. Unless
you're just, I know the leopard gecko thing is the same way. I think the corn snakes aren't there yet, but where they're
breed everything to make sure what's actually in it and stuff. I'm like, all right, man, this is taking out the fun of it. Let's give some people some hets to play with here.
Totally. But, so I mean, yeah, you guys haven't gotten there yet, and that's at least partially because you can still incorporate things that are not tied to that at all in a way that the leopard gecko stuff can't. The wild type subspecies and things have done that.
Really easy to get them out of Afghanistan. Yeah, seems
real. Right. Somehow it just isn't as easy as saying like, "Hey, Justin," it seems, it seems more like Jake. "Hey, Jake, you're going to work and you found a beautiful corn snake. Can you send it to me?"
like you can find one in the wild in South Carolina that looks just about as good as anyone in anyone's collection.
Yeah, totally. I mean, so that's just not something that's successful with the leopard gecko staff. Otherwise, they wouldn't have the issues that they really do. It would still take, it's also the difference between having something that'll lay 15 to 30 eggs than 2 eggs, 4 times in a year or 5 times in a year or whatever. But, not bad stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. But let me see. What else you got? You got anything pairing up this spring? I guess it's pretty late for you for Python guys. I don't know if you got Python projects or anything.
I have some Timors and some lesser Sundus Pythons and Apodora, but none of that is adult staff. I don't know. I try and at this point I'm not. It sounds both bad and good. I'm not interested really in selling people snakes. Certainly in selling them on a given snake. So I mostly don't. It reaches a point in terms of rhinos and stuff where people badger me and convince me that they're really into the species, and then I'm happy to help them out, but I don't want to convince them.
Are you worthy of Rob Stone's rhinos?
Well, it's not even that. Yeah, it's like, especially nowadays, man. So you do get tweener stuff where, so the females as babies, they're small to probe. Once they're about a year old, then they're not so bad. But the issue you can run into is that, females typically will go 2 to 4, and then males will swallow the probe, but you'll get then these ones that are on 6 or 7, and it's like, well, what the heck is that? Add in the fact that they, along with the porphyraceous stuff, they have a genetic sex, but it appears to be overridden by temperature, or at least that's sort of, we have mountains of circumstantial evidence to that point. And, well, what is a tweener? I don't know. So having some ability, and I know you and I talked about this on the Carpet Fest trip, having some visibility into genetic sexing on those in combination with then growing them up for a year or so and then being able to see what they really feel like and look like all helps. But that means that, there's a long period of time where, sure, I have stuff that, eventually will go someplace else, but it's just not there yet. And a lot of people aren't patient enough to wait what might be 6 months to a year or whatever,
But so you don't sell babies unsexed, like younger animals?
Generally speaking, no, because usually I probably want to keep some myself. So like I maybe that's an area where I should be less of a completist myself and just say, okay, well, it is what it is or whatever. But
if you got the resources to do it, why not? And then it helps you in your further projects. I mean, and furthering that project.
And I just like them.
Yeah.
Okay, they're okay, but yeah, eventually some will go someplace else, from last year, but usually that means at the earliest sort of this time for last year's stuff. To that point, I am, and I tried to get my Australia pictures together for this, but I couldn't quite pull it off. But I am going to redo the site because I've grown weary of trolls on iNaturalist, particularly with monitor stuff. So I'm going to make my own, and I have a website now, but it's, you do web design and stuff, right? We can talk about this a little bit. Okay. So you remember, my initial website going back to like 2002, 2003 was strictly code stuff, right? Which is a pain in the butt. Then I remember when Dreamweaver came out in like 2005, and that was like, wow, this is the coolest thing ever, right? You could actually sort of get some visual expression on this, but you could also tweak it in the code so that if you're a perfectionist and you're sitting there looking like that is not perfectly straight, I need to go into the code to actually make sure that it's straight. And then Mac had a sort of preloaded website builder software that was maybe the 2012, 2011, 2010, 2011, something like that. But then they stopped supporting it. And so that's what my website is on now. And it's just how you got to pull out the old computer. It's just a pain in the butt.
Yeah, I tried to use that maybe like 4 or 5 years ago because I have the Adobe suite. I don't remember what the hell it was called, but yeah, it's a lot easier now. Like just a few years after that came out, like Squarespace and Shopify and all those started to come out, so it's just completely obsolete. Even WordPress was a bit easier for a time. That's what my first website was on.
Yeah, so I did. It was like I researched it a little bit, and obviously Wix and Squarespace get all the pub on the podcasts and things. So I did try Squarespace, and I was like, okay, I think I can make this work. So I did start messing around with one. It's going to be very picture heavy, just as a context in which, okay, I can put up the pictures that I want to put up. And I know I do feel a little bit bad. I am working on an article for the Herpetoculture magazine about rhinos and stuff, but after all this time to not have, my website speaks about them, at great length or whatever. So I will try and incorporate some of that, but I think, heavy pictures, that's what people want nowadays, right? That always, Make it easy button with cool pictures.
Yeah. That works for the old attention span.
So
we've gone well over time. I was trying to keep these podcasts to an hour, by the way, for the last couple of weeks. This one's been 2 hours and 40 minutes. So I did really well. But so if anyone wants to check out what you
we
got
didn't even
going
talk about Australia.
I know.
Poly pythons, water pythons, Darwin carpets.
You guys have Eric and Owen and obviously you and Keith are on the show.
One funny thing I will say, Justin Julander, he and I, so Justin's going to, if we can leave the country come the fall, Justin is going to join Eric and myself going to WA, the March trip that was postponed to October. Hopefully it happens. But I mean, don't let Eric hear that. He's just getting by on the hope that the thought that it will happen. So that's what's keeping him putting his feet on the ground in the morning. But, I like to plan the trips. I will say, so that it's a misstatement, right? Or it's a misinterpretation we have that, you just turn up in Australia and there's randomly reptiles everywhere. Well, if you count little Carlia skinks and stuff, then maybe, yeah, sort of, especially in the right habitat, but it's not like there are pythons everywhere. And so you need to really put in the work, put in the research to do this stuff. So I know Eric's been on all these podcasts and, Owen's been on all these podcasts, and there's all this vagueness to, where did we go? What did we do? Where was that we went? As the person who makes the intensive itinerary, I can tell you that, like, having made that beforehand allows you to map what actually happened to the plan, so that it sort of drives me bananas when they're like, "Oh, where were we?" And I'm like, "Dude, we were."
This very highly
there was a whole plan
place that you picked out.
Yeah, it's like, we didn't stumble there. We were there for a reason. It's all in love. But yes, so the notion that the ground has all been covered. The show we did when we came back with Keith, definitely we got into some of that stuff, more of the details and stuff. But it's just funny because it's like, what are you talking about, man? That's not what happened at all. I certainly didn't tell some cop outside of Darwin, outside Adelaide River, that we were looking for reptiles. I would have pretty much done anything before I would do that. That is your own imagination of what you would have said were you the one talking.
So what did Rob Stone say?
I just said I got out of the way because I could tell you guys wanted to go fast. That's what I said to the cop, and they said, fair enough, sounds good. Y'all good? We're good. Just got out of the way for you.
Wasn't
I certainly
unusual.
Didn't say we're looking for reptiles. Are you insane?
I'm guessing. I mean, it's illegal to even touch technically a reptile there, right?
Right.
Even though
there must be some.
Every single Australian do it, and most of them have been venomous. But
yeah, I mean, there's some sort of wildlife rehabilitator or exemption. There's some licensing process, and presumably that differs by state and all this sort of stuff. That maybe you can move it off the road, but yeah, it is the bummer of Australia is like, man, both of the live scrubbies we saw the first trip were preceded. Either very shortly or in the latter case by like an hour or so by seeing one that was hit just beforehand, and that'll put you in a dark place. There's no doubt about that,
Yeah, because that sucks, because here we see roadkill all the time, and you're like, whatever, this is a common animal.
It's a squirrel. Yeah.
Even if it's like somewhat common animal in Australia, it's still not cool, to go halfway across the world and see it.
Yeah, especially when it's like, man, that was, we were on, going down Tully Gorge, and it's like, okay, well, the person who worked at the power plant who came the other direction definitely destroyed that scrub python, because no one else has been on this road all night long. We've been here for 3 hours. Like, that was you, because there was no one else, came up the other way and whatever. And it's like, yeah, it speaks to their resiliency and the fact that, that They still do great, but it doesn't mean I have to
vastness of
have to
Australia
like it.
too.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, for as many roads as there are going through places, there's luckily a lot of, especially in Central Australia, right? I mean,
yeah, I mean that's the weird bit, right? Is that like around Cairns, so in far north Queensland and stuff, and obviously on the east coast and the southern, southeast coast and whatever, there's a ton of roads. The weird bit about Darwin, the Northern Territory, is that there's not nearly as many sort of small roads, which is good for wildlife. But in terms of actually seeing them road cruising and stuff, it's not. It's much more difficult. And it looks like WA is maybe a mixture of the two. There's some spots that there's definitely spots, down east of Perth where there are plenty of roads and stuff. But when you get further north, it seems it's more like Darwin. There's fewer and further between, which is, again, good for the snakes, but bad for maybe finding the snakes.
What would you be looking for if you get to go to Western Australia this year?
Well, certainly Eric would love to find a Southwest carpet. And, I'm happy to see any python in the wild. It's a crazy thrill. Stimmies, womas, there's some spots, womas used to be all over that area. They're far more rare than they used to be, but there are some that are being found up further north within kind of the range of the trip that we're going to do. So it's always fun to do travel, and to Australia is great. Get a toasty, in a flat white, or an ice break. I know that's Eric's. It's basically caffeinated chocolate milk, but it's pretty good, man.
Yeah. I mean, I know that's a trip that is on top of pretty much every herper's list, especially people who are probably tuning into this episode, probably because they are into Indo-Australian python. I feel like our crowd is that way anyway, usually. Yeah. But I was trying to close this out.
I know. I'll let you do it. I'm sorry, man.
No, you're good. So where can people reach out? It's like, I don't even think we got to where people can reach out to you.
Okay. I suppose High Plains Herp on Instagram is kind of an easy way.
Or you can tell everyone to fuck off and not reach out to you if you want to.
No, I mean, that's all right. You can follow the Instagram thing. That's cool. I am working on the Squarespace version of the website, so it doesn't link to it at this point, but I'm going to try and put that together. And at that point, then it'll be all the things will go to it, whether it's highplainsherp.com, rhinorats.com, spelled either way, that sort of stuff. So eventually all those will go there, and hopefully it should be a lot of cool pictures that people enjoy.
Sweet. As for me, Port City Pet, portcitypythons.com. Check out, we have some isopods available, some snakes coming up, some other stuff going on. So keep an eye out. Rob, thanks for coming on with me. And of course, I said that right as you drank your beer, which is an inconvenient time.
Yeah, no worries, man. I appreciate it. It was fun. The video is a bit disconcerting and weird, but it wasn't bad. I appreciate it, and hopefully something was interesting.
You got through it.
Yeah, man.
And right, I appreciate it. It was worth the wait. And we'll have to do, I don't know, one day we'll do something in person, or we need to do like a mega podcast with the NPR folks.
Right. We can do it in Eric's school room or something.
Yeah, exactly. And you have to come over and check out the collection when you guys are here, because I haven't had people over here yet, really. Matt was over, but Eric and Owen haven't been here. So.
Oh my goodness, what are they doing? Yeah, we'll do it, man.
It's my fault. I haven't invited them. It's my fault. I'm not worthy yet. I need to fix some shit up. Make everything pretty.
Right on, man.
Right on. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I will catch you guys next week.